everybody. Welcome to the Boulder City Council's special meeting, not to be confused with yesterday's special meeting. Lynette, will you call the roll?
Councilmember Applebaum.
Here.
Brockett.
Here.
Burton.
Here.
Jones.
Here.
Morzell.
Here.
Shoemaker. Weaver.
Here.
Yates.
Here.
Young. Here. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Before we get started, we have one announcement, and that is we have an opening on our Human Relations Commission. So we are beginning recruiting for someone to fill that seat. The seat goes through March 31st, 2019. And starting tomorrow, we're going to be recruiting, and the application deadline will be September 18th at 5 p.m. Anybody that previously applied for the Human Relations Commission earlier in the year will be considered unless they have noted otherwise. I'll note that the Human Relations Commission generally meets the third Monday of every month at 6 p.m. And we just encourage folks to get involved. And serving on a board and commission is a great way to do that. So if you're interested, please apply. And with that, and you can apply or go get an application on the website at bouldercolorado.gov/boards-commissions. So with that, we have one topic tonight. I will turn it over to our city attorney.
Thank you, Suzanne. Tonight, you're here to consider potential regulation of sexually violent predators in Boulder. In your packets, I've provided some background materials on what you could consider. There are 6 jurisdictions in the state of Colorado that restrict where sexually violent predators can live. Generally, they do it by some sort of distance regulation from things where children are generally gathered: schools, parks, rec centers, pools, daycare centers. So in your packet and on your dais, you have some maps that sort of show what those circles look like. Just as a quick overview, if you were to impose a 1,000-foot regulation from all of those things I just mentioned, it would eliminate over 99% of all the dwelling units in the city of Boulder. So that would effectively ban sexually violent predators in Boulder. When Englewood did this, they imposed a 2,000-foot limit, and that in fact effectively banned sexually violent predators in Boulder, in Englewood, and then they reduced it recently to 1,000 feet. Bob, did you have a question for me?
Yeah, I sorry to interrupt you so early, but are these regulations in these cities, are these places where the sexually violent predators cannot live or cannot be?
Cannot reside. They're residential restrictions.
So they can be in a
Yes.
schoolyard or they can be in a park yard as long as they don't sleep there at night? Is that the distinction that's made?
That's correct, as long as they don't reside there.
Okay.
For those regulations.
Well, I'm struggling with that too, Lisa. So it sounds like they can't reside within a certain distance of these facilities, but they can be there when they're not sleeping, or, I mean, like 18 hours a day they can be there, but they...
Yeah, and there are restrictions on people on probation or parole that control what they can be as well.
Okay.
And I have a group of experts here to sort of talk to you about some of the things and answer those questions much better than I can.
Great, thank you.
CAC asked me to sort of give you an overview of the ordinance and then provide kind of a background on regulation of sex offenders in the state of Colorado and some of the history to just provide some context. And then I'm going to introduce the folks who are here to provide you with more detailed information than I can.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Bob. So sex offender registration basically began during the Clinton administration after a young woman was murdered and raped by someone who was in the neighborhood and didn't know about. So in Colorado, generally, it requires that sex offenders, after release from prison, are required to register with local authorities. These registration requirements continue after periods of supervision. So oftentimes someone is released from prison and has some period under which they're under supervision. Depending on the nature of the crime in Colorado, the restrictions go for 5, 10, 20, or even for life. So some of the things you'll talk about tonight are when someone's under supervision, a probation or parole officer can tell them and control their movements to some extent. But once they're released from those conditions, it's just a reporting requirement. And so you have 2 different kinds of people reporting: people who are still currently under some level of supervision because of a prior conviction, and people who are free to go wherever they want. Sexually violent predators are a subclass of sex offenders, and I'll talk about them in a little detail in a minute, but they are required to register for life, but they can petition to have the registration requirement removed. And as I said, registration can exceed the period of post-release supervision, so that's important to remember when you think about what happens.
And Tom, just for clarity.
Sure.
All of these requirements that you're stating are all state law?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
They're all state law. A sexually violent predator is an adult and can be a child who are convicted of sexual assault, unlawful sexual contact, or sexual assault of a child by one in a position of trust. One of the most important parts is the victim has to be a stranger or someone that the offender got to know for the purpose of victimizing that person. So it's a very specific subclass of offense. Most sexual offenses are committed by people who the victim knows. These are stranger offenses. And most importantly, and somewhat troubling to me, is under state law, to be designated a sexually violent predator, there has to be, based on an assessment tool, a determination that the person is likely to reoffend. So that's why people are troubled by these. That some expert has decided, the board has decided, that the person is likely to reoffend. And again, this is not my area. We have folks here who can answer more detailed questions about this. So in Boulder, we currently have 122 sex offenders registered. The list, if you look online, goes on for 41 pages. 44 of those are registered with no fixed address. State law specifically requires a police chief to accept a registration with no fixed address. Yes, ma'am.
And maybe you want to just wait till the question.
No, I'm always happy to.
So, you know, in looking at the addresses and stuff like that, or where the whereabouts, and maybe this is a Chief Testa question, but I was curious that some of them, you know, are parked in their cars in parking lot, and some people are in a hammock, and I guess it's important that the police know their whereabouts, but don't some of those actions somewhat violate our camping?
So that's my next point.
Oh, okay.
You're not allowed to register with no fixed location. And this is what the state law says, if it includes a residence or location that would violate state law or local ordinance. Your question about camping is a good one. Our camping ordinance is very specific, and the registrations don't generally provide sufficient information for it to be a violation of our camping ordinance. Our camping ordinance requires that someone remain in a place at night and that they conduct activities of daily living, cooking, cleaning, shelter. And so we have to prove those elements. If someone says, I'm sleeping in a park, that doesn't necessarily violate our camping ordinance per se, because the camping ordinance requires something in additional to sleeping. It requires shelter or other activities of daily living, which is why, I mean, and as you recall, Lisa, because you've been doing this for a while, the camping ordinance was very narrowly drawn to really address camping, not just someone sleeping someplace overnight. So in my review of those, none of them actually on their face violate the camping ordinance. Now, there could be some. There was one who used to be registered at an abandoned building. Now, arguably, that's trespass because it's not his property, it's someone else's property, and we could theoretically charge that. But again, you'd have to have, to prove trespass, you have to have knowledge that it's a trespass. Usually there has to be a sign or something or some knowledge. And so just that registration alone probably also doesn't qualify that. I'd have trouble thinking of any kind of registration that would fit the language within the state ordinance, state statute that's a per se violation of law.
Thank you.
So of our 44 registered of our 122 sex offenders, 4 are sexually violent predators. 3 of those are registered with no fixed address and are registered at the homeless shelter. They are each registered in a different program, or at least on their registration it provides a different program. One's in the summer bed program, one's in the parole program, and one's in the First Step program. Now, I wasn't able to do a detailed analysis, but I asked the police department if a significant number of our registered sex offenders list the homeless shelter as their residence. So I asked the police department if there was any data that showed that sex offenses were higher in the area around the shelter, and they said no. In fact, the highest level of sex offenses is where you'd expect, downtown in District 3, that the district that incorporates the shelter has no higher level of sex offenses than any other part of the city, which you'll hear also correlates with the data you'll get from some of the experts about whether or not folks are more likely to commit a crime around where they're sleeping. And speaking of experts, I've asked a group of folks at the request of the CAC to come to speak to you briefly. I've asked them to talk about 5 minutes and then to be available to answer questions. We have Michelle Gang, who's from the Colorado Division of Justice Sex Offender Management Office. She has experience in managing sex offenders and in going after child sex abuse. Katerina Booth, who's here on behalf of District Attorney Stan Garnett. She's the first Assistant District Attorney. She's also former head of the Sex Crime Unit. Greg Brown, who is the Chief Probation Officer for Boulder County Probation. Greg Testa, who I think you've met before, and Greg Harms, who's hiding in the back over there, did not come forward. But so they're each going to talk a little bit about their view of this subject and provide you with a chance to answer questions. So Michelle, did you want to go first? Michelle has a PowerPoint, which I will get up there for her.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting the Department of Public Safety to come and speak on this important issue of residency restriction. We appreciate it. I wanted to start out by giving you a little bit of history. In 2003 and 2004, the State General Assembly Joint Judiciary Committee talked and discussed about passing statewide residency restriction laws. And they asked the Department of Public Safety to do a research study prior to actually putting something into law to see if it made sense for the state of Colorado, that those residency restrictions made sense and would create a safer community. So the Department of Public Safety set out and completed that study, and they found two important things. They found, one, that residency restrictions did not have an impact on recidivism rates, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, and that preventing sex offenders from living near their families and support systems actually impeded effective community supervision by parole and probation, and impeded an offender's ability to be successful because they lost resources like transportation from family members, because when they start out on parole, they can't drive, or some financial benefits of living in a stable home and having food every night. So there were some serious consequences to those residency restrictions when the study was completed. So the General Assembly made a wise decision and decided to not enact such restrictions within the state of Colorado. I got it, thank you. So I wanted to share some share some well-established research regarding recidivism for you folks, just so you have some information about what the experts are saying statewide and then across the nation as well. And so we'll start out with national statistics, And one study found here that in treatment and supervision, well, first of all, so that you know, we're charged in treatment and supervision with assisting offenders in establishing pro-social lifestyles that are incompatible with reoffending. So that's what parole does, that's what probation does, that's what treatment does, that's what law enforcement does when they go out and check on these guys. We found the research across the research studies all support that with stable housing, employment, and social support, these guys are much less likely to commit a new offense. Sex offenders who successfully complete treatment are, of course, less likely to recidivate. Treatment works. In Colorado, our recidivism rates are extremely low. So guys re-prosecuted for another sex crime, those rates are very low. Child molesters in Colorado who reoffend did not live, I repeat, did not live closer to schools, parks, or daycare centers than those who did not reoffend. So proximity to those locations had no impact on recidivism rates. And again, those that do well on supervision in our communities are those that have support from positive support system, from positive role models, from positive friends, and that those who had those in place had lower numbers of probation violations, parole violations, and recidivism. There was a study done in Broward County, Florida. Dr. Jill Levinson interviewed 109 convicted sex offenders after residency restrictions went in effect in Broward County, Florida. And what she found was that according to the offenders, the majority were forced to move out of their homes. Life became very unstable. They lost jobs. They lost access to jobs because they no longer had transportation, such as bus. Many faced homelessness, and 3/4 of them, so it was 74%, stated that residency restrictions are not going to prevent me from reoffending. If I want to reoffend, I can do it. Residency restrictions are not going to prevent that from happening. And I thought that was very significant to read that in that study. With offenders saying that residency restrictions aren't going to keep people safe, they're not going to prevent them from reoffending, that's some pretty strong evidence. There was another study done in Minnesota. This included 224 offenders out of the Minnesota Department of Corrections. And the interview with them, the interviews and case file studies talked about where offenders recidivated and if the residency restrictions in Minnesota actually had effect on recidivism. And what they found, of all those 224 offenses, none of them would have been prevented by residency restrictions. Most sex offenses happen in offender's home or in the victim's home, and that's key, and I'm about to get to more research on that. Most sex offenses happen in a place where we feel safe and are therefore vulnerable, and we're in the presence of someone we trust, and that's important.
Michelle, can I ask you a question on that?
Yes, sir.
Not to interrupt you, but I thought that Tom described, tonight we're talking about sexually violent predators, which I think are defined as people who typically don't know their victims. And so I think you're talking about statistics where there's inappropriate behavior between people who know each other, right? I mean, are we mixing apples and oranges here?
I don't think so, because I think your assumption's inaccurate,
Which assumption?
that sexually violent predators don't know their victims.
Oh, I thought that's how you defined it, Tom.
No, the definitions, there's 3 definitions that have to be determined in a sexually violent predator assessment. 1 is if they're a stranger to the victim. It's
Right.
yes, no. 2 is did they promote a relationship in order to be able to offend? And did they establish a relationship in order to offend? And the promote and establish means that they've known their victims. It could be for a lengthy period of time or a shorter period of time.
Okay, do you know the mix between those 2 categories?
I do not have those statistics with me tonight.
Thanks.
Sure. So to talk about collateral consequences, just briefly, when people lose housing, it increases a lot of instability for folks. It increases a risk of homelessness, which increases an inaccurate registry. And for law enforcement, the key to registry is being able to track these guys and to be able to determine where they are. And I will talk in a minute about communities who have imposed residency restrictions and the increase in violations of registry laws. And of course, as I already talked about, the loss of employment increases instability, and if they're away from support systems where they can't have that support system and that contact, that increases risk for reoffense as well. In addition, we see when we have these restrictions, that all of a sudden people, sex offenders, sexually violent predators, are moved to typically locations in the town where there's a lot of poverty, or the low income areas, or disenfranchised communities. And so that raises a lot of concerns about how the affluent can move offenders who are SVP or sexually offenders and move them into less affluent, less powerful communities who have less of a voice because they don't know how to organize.
What is inaccurate registry? I mean, I can imagine what it is, but how do you define?
Sure, that they register as homeless, so we don't know where they are, but they're actually spending the night at their parents' house, even though they're not supposed to, that kind of thing.
And why can't they stay with their parents again?
Well, if there's residency restrictions in place and their parents live within an area where they can't reside,
I get it, okay.
they lie about it. Because you'd rather sleep in a warm bed than out on the street, right? Yes. A little bit more information about statistics. 93% of child sex abuse victims knew their abuser. 93% of children know who abuses them. They get access to the children through building trust with the children and grooming their families so that their families also support and trust the offender. Most sexual offenses are committed in the offender's home or the victim's home, and the younger the age of the child victim, the younger the child is, the more likely they are to be victimized by someone they know. I think this is just going to repeat what I said before, so I'm just going to move on. And then I wanted to point out one other thing. The national laws that have been put in place are laws that reflect what usually does not happen in a sex assault case. So here's what I want to share with you. Nationwide, of the 60 to 70,000 arrests for sexual assault each year, 115 of them constitute abduction by strangers. That's less than 1%. And while it's tragic and horrific and terrible that that happens, it's less than 1%. So we make laws that affect the entire nation based on less than 1% of the crimes out there. Family dynamics are what make children more vulnerable to sexual assault than proximity to sexual offenders. This was a report came out of California. It's a pretty powerful, impactful study. And the bottom line was we need to have good supervision. We have to be careful about who we let in our homes. And when we have homes where we let a lot of traffic come in, such as where there's substance abuse or whatever the case might be, those homes are at higher risk for offense, and residency restrictions aren't going to solve that matter either. 87% of people arrested for sexual offense were never previously convicted of a crime. Most people who commit a sexual offense never have been arrested before, and they'll never be arrested again. But that's a unique statistic when you look at other offenders who tend to, they get arrested for a burglary and they move on and commit more offenses. In 2008, so I know this is a dated information, but of these areas that put in residency restrictions, and several of them, Castle Rock particular, and I believe Commerce City had residency restrictions just for SVPs, all of those jurisdictions saw an increase in people who went underground and stopped registering, so they lost track of offenders. And when you lose track of sex offenders, that can be concerning. So law enforcement in all those jurisdictions lost track of sex offenders because they stopped registering.
Michelle, can you elaborate on that? So that was kind of a general statement. So
I didn't see you saying.
how do we know that they went underground? In other words, did we know that there were people who had previously registered who stopped registering but were still in the city? And how does that compare to cities that didn't have residency restrictions?
So in 2008, in those areas with residency restrictions, we looked at the number of registries. First of all, in 2008, we had law that said you had to register in the jurisdiction where you reside, and then you had to deregister. So you had to let a jurisdiction know when you arrived, and you had to let a jurisdiction know when you were moving out. That law has since changed. But that's how law enforcement knew where people were. And then they had to notify. So if I came here to Boulder, and I'm a sex offender, and I registered with you, and then I was going to move to Longmont, in 2008, I would have to come to you and say, I'm moving to Longmont. This is the address I'm moving to. And you would take me off your registry, and I would move to Longmont, and I would have 5 days to register. And then you could check with Longmont to make sure that I registered. So we had kind of a pretty good system of keeping track of guys, or gals for that matter. So back then, what they looked at was those who registered and then didn't deregister, but we couldn't find them within CBI. We couldn't find them within the state of where they went. So we didn't know where they were. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but was the rate of the couldn't find it people higher in these cities statistically than they were in other cities?
We didn't compare, I don't think we compared other cities, because what we were asking these jurisdictions was, you have residency restrictions in place now.
Right.
Did people comply with registry or did they not? And they said they all had an increase in noncompliance.
Compared to historical?
Yes.
And was there an increase or decrease or no change in noncompliance in other cities?
I don't know the answer to that.
So we don't know conclusively that the noncompliance was directly correlated to the restrictions. Is that correct?
No.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
I have a question as well.
Sure.
Do you need to follow up on that?
Well, I was just curious. One of the results of zoning restrictions might be that people just move somewhere else. And how, as opposed to not registering here, they might just leave, right? Is that, is there a way to know if that's what happened in these cases?
I could look at the data again. In these cases, they looked for the guys. So if they had Tom Smith and he's not registering anymore, they went to CBI and said, do you have this guy registered somewhere? And they did not have him registered somewhere.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Could you pull up your 3 requirements for being labeled a sexually violent predator?
That was in my slide.
No, I've got, okay, well,
Yeah.
Hers?
No,
so I
it's not mine.
thought there was, she listed unknown and then created a relationship in order to sexually offend and cultivated a
I
relationship
think
with
that
them.
was Tom.
I'll get it up there.
No, I have,
I did mention that, and I think that Mr. Brown can speak to this more than I can because I don't complete those evaluations. But for a sexually violent predator, there's a number of portions to that sexually violent predator assessment. One of them is if they established that if they were a stranger, if they promoted a relationship for sexual assault purposes, or if they established a relationship for sexual assault purposes. Any one of those checked is a concern.
Okay, yeah, in the memo, it says, convicted of sexual assault on a child, or sexual assault on a child by one in a position of trust, as 1, 2, whose victim was a stranger, and 3, who based on risk assessment screening is likely to reoffend. So I guess it's the second one here that has this either a stranger or promoted a relationship. So yeah, we'll need to hear a little bit about that because that's meaningful to me.
Okay. but we should-
Greg can talk more about that.
Why don't we
He's an
let you
expert on that.
finish, and then let's ask questions at the end unless there's a clarifying thing.
And
I'm talking to these guys. Go ahead. Are you done?
thank you. I think I'm finished.
Oh, you
There
are
are no
done.
other
All right.
questions.
Then let's ask you some questions.
Okay.
Sorry. Aaron?
So thank you for that explanation. And I understand how it establishes that sex offenders in general are usually known to victims, right? So those are great points. In the statistics that you have, do you have any breakdowns about statistics for the sexually violent predators versus the sex offender population at large?
I don't. There's so few sexually violent predators, but we do not have those statistics.
Yeah, because I'm a little concerned about everybody just left. But
I think I could get those for
apples and
you.
oranges question here of the general sex offender population versus the specific SVPs that we're talking about tonight.
Yes, I am. One of the issues is every state defines sexually violent predator differently, and that's kind of an outdated designation in any case. So nationally, the statistics would be hard. Within the state of Colorado, folks were submitting to the Division of Criminal Justice every sexually violent predator assessment that was completed. So we would be able to pull those stats. We could pull those stats from what we have, but I know that people aren't consistently submitting those, so those stats won't be. They may not be valid or. But they would give you an idea.
Be interesting anyway. Yeah.
Would you like me to follow up on that?
Potentially. I mean, maybe
Okay.
we'll see how the discussion goes
Okay.
tonight. It may be valuable.
Okay.
So I was curious about repeat sexual offenders. And at what point do they change maybe their classification? And then there's like first degree and there's third degree. Could you go into that a little bit?
Actually, I think our district attorney could probably do a better job of that because in terms of registration purposes, we have the sexually violent predator and then we have all the other sex offenders. She can talk about the crimes and degrees and convictions and those kinds of things. I'm not a lawyer, thank goodness. We did propose to the legislature that we do registration based on risk instead of. Because law enforcement came to us and we had a committee going, and they really wanted to know who in our community is really the highest risk to reoffend, so we can keep a better eye on them. And there's guys that don't meet the SVP criteria, but my experience as a probation officer would tell you that some of those guys were very dangerous, and we had to keep a very close eye on them. So I don't want you to have the false belief that only the SVPs are the dangerous ones out there.
And if I could ask one more question. As a probation officer, how often do you see a client?
I will let Greg answer that.
Oh.
I have been out of the field for a couple of years, so I don't
Okay,
want to give
okay.
you the wrong information.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're good. Thank you.
So I'm curious, at a state policy level, who's looking at this and trying to improve the situation? Is there, if we had concerns about how the policies are being made in Colorado, who do we go talk to and what's being advanced by them?
Yes, absolutely. You would talk to my boss, Christopher Lombano-Vrostowski, and give him a call and say, hey, we're concerned about this, and come on in, and then we figure out what to do.
What office is that? Sorry, what office is that?
It's under the Department of Public Safety, and it's the Division of Criminal Justice, and we are the sex offender management unit, I guess.
Okay.
Well, let me just follow up on that. One of the most disturbing aspects of this is the notion that somebody is likely to recommit a violent crime. Like, that's concerning. And I guess, right, or at least that's how we are told to understand this category. And the question is, as a state then, do we have good policies in place to just release these folks without a good plan to make sure that doesn't happen? And it doesn't feel like that's in place.
So, and I've been to your community a few times, so I think some of those questions, Chris would be a good start, but then we'd have to pull in parole and learn more about how parole planning happens from a facility into the community, and then probation could talk about sentencing. They have their terms and conditions and supervision's very strict within the community, but I'll let Greg talk more about that.
Right.
Or wherever he was.
Is that good
Other
for now?
questions for Michelle?
Yeah, well, what?
Any other questions for Michelle?
Oh, no, thank you for being here. We may have some more later.
Okay, thanks, you're welcome.
Really appreciate it.
Greg, do you want to? Or Catherine?
Good evening. My name is Katarina Booth. I'm the first Assistant District Attorney for the 20th Judicial District, Boulder County. I'm here this evening representing Stan Gurnett. I do have a unique position, however, in speaking to you tonight. I was, until just January of this year, the chief of the sex assault unit for the last, felony sex assault for the last about 8 years, and then also had 2 other years of experience working that caseload. So I do feel well equipped to speak to you about sex offender practices, specifically our prosecution decision-making and our concerns about safely managing those offenders in the community. There was a number of things that were just thrown out that I think I could speak to. I was originally thinking about what I would say, but maybe I could just start to answer some of your questions, and that may be the most direct route. I will agree with Ms. Gang that the SVP designation, and as that's described, there is that alternative in there, or. And the or, when you look at the SVP assessment tool, there's 4 different criteria, or sections, I should say. Within the section of defining the relationship, it does have those alternatives. Are they a stranger? Or are they promoting the relationship or establishing the relationship such that it provides them that opportunity to commit their sex offense? So it is a misnomer to think that our SVPs are stranger sex offenses. So that is the first thing that I would like to clarify. And in fact, I have prosecuted probably hundreds of sex offenders at this point, and it is a rarity to get an SVP designation. And I have to admittedly say that sometimes it's not exactly how you might believe a particular person and what their risk factors are on paper, how they'll score out on the SVP. Now, I want to comment on that because I'm sure my words will be used against me in some other future meeting. The Sex Offender Management Board does a really great job at looking at how we are looking at SVPs and that specific tool. The SOMB board, so the Sex Offender Management Board, is a group of stakeholders from all the various kind of disciplines that would come together in that practice of prosecuting, defending, judging, supervising sex offenders in our community. The SVB tool is one thing that I think they're currently looking at, revising, and making sure that it's more evidence-based and aligned with research. What I can tell you as a practitioner, as a prosecutor, the SVP tool, that particular element, the defining that relationship, does have a subjectivity about it. When you're asking judges or sex offender evaluators or probation officers to define if that relationship was for the reason of promoting or establishing. And so that's why we have some degree of potential error or non-error in that particular tool. The other way I've seen that tool misused is defendants may exercise their constitutional right to not answer or participate in parts of that examination, and specifically the 4th section talks about that risk for recidivism. How we do that risk for recidivism is oftentimes through different mental health assessments. One very specific and important tool that we look at is the PCLR, or the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, that was established by Dr. Hare. And the research has demonstrated that over and over and over, not only with sex offenders, but with other criminals, when you have high psychopathy, it correlates to high recidivism rates. Again, across the board for different criminals, but it has been established multiple times with sex offenders. So if I'm a defense attorney, I may caution my client or advise my client to exercise their rights. And if they can't do a fully informed, for example, PCLR, that psychopathy checklist, then I have seen offenders that I thought maybe should be an SVP. It was a stranger. It was a stranger on campus who did not get labeled one way or the other on the SVP because he chose to exercise his constitutional rights and not participate in that section. There's supposed to be fallbacks for that, but it didn't work. Yeah.
I just got to follow up on
Sure.
that. I mean, there's one risk, which is getting false positive evaluations of SVPs, and there's another risk, which is you don't catch everybody up in your analysis. It sounds to me like people aren't answering the psychopathy questions, then they're more likely to get away not designated SVP, but people who are answering them do show that psychopathic tendency will get caught up in that and be labeled an SVP. Does that sound accurate?
I think it can go both ways, actually. But yes, I think you certainly can be estimating and not capturing all those that are SVPs. I do think, and I have seen, that SVP designation carries a pretty heavy hammer for sex offenders. And so because of that, that's a hotly litigated designation that we see come back, that we're asking our courts to make particular findings about SVP offenders, and sometimes they're not in the best position to have the most amount of information around that, and so that they may assess or they may over assess depending on the information that they have before them. I think it can go both ways. Yes, sir.
Thanks. You said that you've prosecuted several hundred of these, and I understand only a small percentage are SVPs. Within the group that are designated as SVPs, just based on your experience, what's the proportion of those that are strangers to the victim versus those that build this relationship of trust?
So I was quickly looking at the list. I know the 4 that are currently SVPs. I know one was a stranger, one I prosecuted myself. That was an established or promoted relationship. And the other 2, I'd have to look into one more time. I didn't prosecute them myself.
Just off the top of your head, over your years and years of experience, what would you say roughly? Is it 1/3, 2/3, 50/50, 90/10? Just give us a general idea.
I still think it's more probably disproportionately that they are promoting or establishing the relationship, and then they have those extra risk assessments, so psychopathy or otherwise. Because our overall statistics of sex offenders, it's so rarely the stranger. And that's true both of adult and child. I know Michelle gave you the child statistics, but that's true for adult sex offenders as well. So it's still disproportionately they are. The establishing and promoting, especially, of course, is in the child context, right? So the scenario is that I have started to date this particular person. Let's say I'm a male sex offender. I'm dating this female in order to have access to her children, right? I'm establishing or promoting that relationship in that way so I can get to that child so that I can offend against that child.
Would it be a fair statement, again, just using the universe of SVPs, that a majority, maybe a significant majority of them, are either strangers to their victim or they're predators who have attacked children? Would that be a general statement? If those are the 2 categories, would that be a majority of the SVPs?
That I have seen, yes.
Okay.
Strangers or that have offended against children.
Thank you.
Along those same lines, I guess I would, jumping to a couple other things about releasing folks and state policies, as well as recidivism and how we're looking at that. As you know, Mr. Garnett established made a position statement for the board, and I believe it was at least referred to in some publications today as well. And in general, the concerns around an ordinance is what will that ordinance provide in the way of actually supervising and enforcing our ability to manage a SVP in the community? Meaning, if you provide an ordinance that says you can't be unless you're like trying to get them out of the city entirely, right? But other than that, if you create an ordinance such that the penalties and the teeth that we have may not be such that the the state dialogue right now and what is available to parole officers in violating parolees, sex offenders, or SVPs while they're on parole or otherwise. What are we going to do in the long run? How is that going to help us actually manage them and keep them safer in the community if, let's say, it's a couple days in jail or some fines or whatever, and then they're right back out to exactly where we are. And so that's one of the practical concerns of how does the ordinance actually increase our safety in managing those sex offenders in our community. I think where I align with Mr. Garnett, of course, is that I think our focus should be at state legislation. And so the question was, where can we manage at a state level? And at a state level, where our focus should be and where our concerns are, the general narrative these days and that you hear, and myself as a prosecutor that I hear, is that we're having more and more sex offenders being released from prison, and especially our indeterminate sex offenders. So some of those, of course, are going to have that SVP designation. Some may not.
Excuse me, what's an indeterminate sex?
Sorry. So the change in the sex offender sentencing laws happened primarily to go from what we call determinate to indeterminate in 1998. Indeterminate is why you hear, or sometimes you read in the paper when people say it's 12 years to life. That to life is an indeterminate. By way of quick example, if I commit a burglary, I commit a theft, a drug offense or something, the judge will sentence me somewhere between, say for a class 4 felony, it's between 2 to 6 years, that the judge will sentence me to 2 or 4 or 6 or whatever that determinate number is. If I'm a sex offender committing a class 4 felony, the court would sentence me to 2 to 6 to life. To life being that we have empowered a lot of discretion into our parole board, the Department of Corrections, and otherwise to decide when that person should be released in our community. So that is the narrative we need to be looking at, is at a state level, are the parole board equipped with the right amount of time, amount of resources, the right amount of information in order to properly review the sex offenders who are being released into our community, including SVPs? And are they armed with all the right information in order to make that decision? And so that's part of the dialogue. The other part is,
Finish
and then I'll get there. The other way that they're coming back into our community from DOC is through our community corrections programs. So you're going to have them either funnel through community corrections and placement that way, or you're going to have a direct release to probation and being out on probation or parole. So there's alternative ways that they can be supervised in our community, and where we need to really focus is, are we getting the right people out? And if the right people are out, are our resources with the parole supervision department such that they can properly manage them and make sure they keep track of them and have the right tools around managing them to help reduce recidivism rates? So I think that's the general premise behind ordinances and how much they can or cannot actually help us keep the community safe, which is what our focus is.
We have a couple of questions.
Yes.
There's a queue. Lisa and then Aaron. Sure.
So you talked about your office, or at least you and Attorney Garnett, are you don't want, or you don't think it's good to have these local ordinances in place. So I have a question about, and that you should focus on the state legislature. So my question is, at the state legislature, could you advocate for maybe some transition program for people who were imprisoned for a sexual offense and then are coming out? My understanding, and might not be correct, is that in places, in some states like California, that they have when these individuals are released from prison, they have to go through some kind of a transition program or something, so that they're basically transitioning back into public rather than prison one day, public space the next day, without any help or guidance or whatever. Would there be a way that we could maybe work with our state legislature? Or one, do you know of something like that? And two, could you focus, not you, but we, focus at the state legislature on prolonged kind of transitions for release?
So yes, of course, it has a huge fiscal note attached to it, right? And that's usually been the prohibitive factor. So what we see is, despite assurances that people won't be paroling, are indeterminate sex offenders. So meaning those that have been convicted and have gone to prison on an indeterminate, that to life designation is getting out, that they wouldn't parole homeless. We are seeing them parole homeless. The alternative, the best analogous thing we have to what you're suggesting in California, is our community corrections program. So every jurisdiction has their community corrections, or looks, your halfway houses, as it's commonly referred to. So they can parole through, and transition is exactly what they call it. They're transition cases. They're transitioning before their parole eligibility date into our community corrections program, or they can do that as a condition of their parole. So then they can get some potential additional supervision, restrictions, and treatment while they're in that transition. But we're seeing a lot just transition straight out to parole. One of the SVPs that is noted, that was the way that they ended up, or at least two that I know of, have come out directly from prison, directly out into the community without going through the community corrections program. That often has to do with how long their sentences are at the upfront and what that amount is for when they can transition out as well.
So are SVPs different in terms of their requirement to wear GPS bracelets? Are they required to wear GPS bracelets? And is that different from other sexual offenders? Do sexual offenders have to wear these type of bracelets?
So any sex offender, in fact, any felon potentially on there as a condition of their parole, can be required to wear a GPS unit. I do know that some of these offenders on this list are, and some are not. So it is up to the parole division, the supervision, the parole department that's supervising the offenders to make that distinction and in order. But they do have that tool available to them. It's, again, something that's actually, again, quite costly, both for the devices and for the ability to actually supervise them while they're on that device, to have somebody monitoring it.
So is there a central location where these people are monitored? So somebody who is monitoring these people?
No, that's up to their probation officer or their
Just one
parole
person?
officer. Mhm.
Okay.
Okay, we have Aaron and then Sam.
Thanks for being here. I
Sure.
appreciate your testimony. There's an implication in what you said before that perhaps the indeterminate, people who are getting indeterminate sentences are coming out maybe early and frequently. Did I misunderstand that?
No, you did not misunderstand that.
Okay. So I'm curious about that because, like, we heard in a recent sex assault conviction in Boulder, there was a judge who was concerned that guys should go into the indeterminate sentencing program and never come out again because they're under-resourced and they don't get to people. So there's a kind of a contradiction there. Could you speak to that a little bit?
So a couple of things. I think that's been the narrative. I've been in the office, well, if you start from when I first started in the office, it was about 1995 to 96. I was there in 1998 when the sex offender laws changed, and I've watched how that has practiced over the last 18 years. There was a time period where no one was getting out. That's commonsensically accurate because you had to get the offense past 1998, you had to get them to prosecution, you had to get them sentenced, and then they had to serve a certain amount of their time before they were ever even going to come up for parole. So the narrative and that drum started back then where no one's ever getting out. Well, that was true for about the first 6, 8, 9 years. In the last 3 years, we've seen a pretty dramatic spike in those offenders that are being released on the indeterminate sentences. My counterpart, a public defender, a private defense attorney, would disagree with me and would argue to the court, and it's very commonplace every time that I'm in court to say, Judge, you can't sentence them to indeterminate because they'll never get out. This is a young man. We can manage them in the community, we can provide the right resources, and if you send them there, they'll never get out. I would tell you that I believe that tide has shifted, and I see that the tide has shifted. There's been a lot of articles over the last couple years. think it was already 2 years ago, a pretty popularized one out of the Denver Post that said the unintended consequences of indeterminate sentencing, and that we have this pretty substantial backlog of sex offenders serving indeterminate and just lingering in the Department of Corrections, not getting out. So the SOMB board has worked really hard at examining why is that and what can they do. The Department of Corrections obviously has had multiple pressures around how they might manage that backlog that was referred to in these studies. And so I have seen in my practical, day in, day out, of seeing sex offenders come through. We're seeing them parole more often. We're seeing them transition through community corrections more often. And that's consistent with the spike of the numbers of sex offenders that are coming out into the community. And I think that's the trend that's going to continue, of course. There is a deficiency of sex offender evaluators and treatment providers in the Department of Corrections system for some obvious reasons. Lots of times our prison facilities are not in locations that are very desirable to live, very, very small rural communities, or that there's just not that many providers who want to work with that kind of clientele. So, our suggestions are looking at trying to provide more urban-based facilities so that those sex offenders can get that treatment while being incarcerated before being paroled. And there's got to be some other ways that we can manage that better than just paroling them homeless or otherwise.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, a few questions. Thank
Sure.
you for being here. Could you talk a little more about community corrections programs? Where does the funding come from those? Where's the one in Boulder or Boulder County? Can you just give us a little local flavor for that and how many people work there and so on?
So I'm going to keep punting a little bit, but Greg can really speak to that because he actually is partly in charge of working on and collaborating with community corrections. We have 2 different primary locations, one in Boulder and one in Longmont, that they transition back through. Our general approach in Boulder County, this is not true of other counties, but we do have a very strong sex offender probation department in our probation. So our general approach in prosecution often is to use Department of Corrections for the punitive aspect and impose or request basically a DOC sentence for the punitive part of recognizing the seriousness of these offenses. And as they transition back into the community, we ask for consecutive probation supervision as opposed to parole supervision. So we don't tend to use our community corrections as often as other jurisdictions, at least on the upfront. And that's because you can have more turnover in your community corrections staff. The case managers have a less ability to supervise them, are not as trained as well as our probation officers are in this jurisdiction. So we tend to utilize what are our best ways to manage them, and that's through probation after DOC. We don't really kind of rely on DOC to rehabilitate and to transition them back out to the community, but we are seeing more and more come through that transition route to community corrections. And then they're under parole supervision as opposed to probation supervision.
Got it. So let's make sure I understand. So halfway houses are associated with probation?
They can be, and Greg is.
All right, we'll wait on that.
Yeah.
Let's go back
Okay.
to GPS, and maybe
Sure.
I should wait on that too. But it seems to me in this day and age of GPS tracking, we would be able to be creative about, the goal, I think, is to keep people who are at high risk to reoffend away from the most vulnerable populations in town.
Sure.
And so I don't know if a housing restriction is a blunt tool to do that. It sounds like at least some people think it's a blunt tool. How about as those GPS records are collected, what can be done with them legally? Like, can a probation officer find that someone, sexually violent predator with the GPS, has gone into a place they're not allowed to go and do something with that information?
They can set exclusion zones, and Greg can speak more specifically about that, and that's what they do with GPS, is you don't set where they can go, you set where they are excluded therefrom, and then you can see when it goes off if they've gone into that excluded zone. So that can be around victim addresses, school addresses, parks, whatever. And so that's how that's monitored. Of course, what we need is a way that those devices stay charged so that they can stay active, so that they can be monitored. That that has come up, and I know in other SVP notification meetings that's come up, where that's one of the great benefits of having people go to the homeless shelter, which I know people do not like, and I understand that, but that gives that a place and a forum so that those devices can be being charged. We can monitor where they're at better. I have had, and I know of an SVP in this community who stayed in their truck or their car slash RV camper, and you don't have that same ability with that GPS device like you do if they're at the homeless shelter.
Got you. So what's and I'll wait, I guess I should wait till the next person comes up. If you had to estimate, what fraction of sexually violent predators have GPSs? Because you said of the whole world of sex offenders, there's some that do and some that don't.
Yeah.
But of SVPs, do they all get GPS?
I don't know. And I'm sorry, I don't know that answer.
Who would know that answer? I mean,
The parole board, or the supervision, so there's the parole board, and then there's the division of parole that's supervising, so your parole supervision. So there's a Longmont office that supervises in this particular area that would have that information about if they're transitioning, the SVPs that are transitioning out onto parole, how many of them are they hooking up to GPS?
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Bob?
We're real keen to get into the whole GPS thing and parole, and so I think we will in a second, but so I'll try to limit my question to a legal one for either you or Tom.
Yes.
Can a city impose additional conditions of parole? For example, let's say the parole board determined that a person doesn't have to have an ankle bracelet, or let's say the parole office determined that the person could go anywhere he wanted to. Can a city, over and above that, say, dear parole office, over and above your constraints, we want to put additional constraints. We don't want this person to go this place. We want this person to wear an ankle bracelet. Can we do that? That's a legal question.
I think we can do anything, Bob, but I would be concerned that probation and parole are matters of statewide concern, and that there would be a stronger preemption of argument. I'm not aware of any city that's tried that.
Okay.
I don't know that's ever been litigated, but that would be the argument that.
So the preemption argument with the state is we've made a determination this person can go to schools, and we're saying we don't want him to go to schools, and the state's going to say we're going to let this person go to schools. Is that the position the state would take?
I'm pretty sure that wouldn't be the argument, Bob. I think the argument would be that the state has a comprehensive scheme of regulating offenders, in particular on probation and parole, and that cities can't impose different restrictions than the state imposes.
Even if those restrictions are cumulative or greater?
That would be the argument. Again, it hasn't been litigated, so I can't give you a definitive answer.
Thanks.
Mary?
A very simple question. What is the difference between parole and probation?
Fairly, actually, it's significant. So your local probation would be oftentimes when we're prosecuting an offender, they're going to go a multitude of directions. But in lieu of going to prison, you're going to go through probation. For sex offenders, there's what's called sex offender intensive supervised probation, what we call SOISP, all these acronyms all the time, right? So probation, and then there's enhanced probation, there's sex offender intensive supervision probation, but that means they're completely automatically sentenced directly into the community. You then have community corrections, which is also, it's a diversion from prison. You're not going to prison yet. You can go directly to community corrections, which is a halfway house. This gets really complicated, so it's not a simple answer. For sex offenders on indeterminates, that can actually be a condition of their probation. So we can sentence somebody to SOISP, indeterminate sentencing, and have community corrections being another placeholder for them. No other law, no other crime is like that. You can also come to community corrections the way I just told you. You were in prison, and you're going to transition out through community corrections before coming out onto parole. Parole only comes when you've gone to prison. So probation, SOISP, community corrections, then prison. And if you go to prison, you're going to come out onto parole, unless, again, you've transitioned through community corrections. But community corrections would be a placeholder then for parole. Does that make sense? So it's totally different bodies. They're both state agencies, but their levels of expertise or caseload or abilities could vary widely from jurisdiction to jurisdiction on what you have in your probation department versus what you have available for parole.
So parole only happens after an individual has been to prison?
Correct.
Thank you.
Maybe I should have been that simple.
Oh,
Sorry.
That was helpful.
I got
Okay.
one more. So, do all sexually violent predators come through the correction system? Is it pretty typical that to get the sexually violent predator label, that you're going to have a severe enough felony that you're going to go to prison?
Generally speaking, yes.
Okay.
So then following those last two questions, the folks that are out in the community now are almost all in parole, not probation, right? They've all been convicted of a felony, they've served their time in prison, and they've been paroled as opposed to some sort of probationary diversion, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so we can just talk about parole and just forget about probation for our purposes tonight.
Kind of.
Okay,
There are some that we still do probation on the other side because we think we can get better supervision through probation. But generally speaking, for the 4 that you have here, they're parole.
Okay, maybe good enough for now. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Anyhow, you're next, I guess. Thank you.
I'm Greg Brown from probation. I think probably a lot has been said, questions that you have. I can talk a little bit more about the halfway houses, although Katarina did a nice job. They're funded through a state fund called Senate Bill 4. It's called prison diversion. That money funnels through the county community corrections division, and there's a citizen and professional board that review all cases either coming from prison or that the court's considering as diversion, that make decisions on whether they would be safe in the community and under what conditions. I will tell you that almost every sex offender that's coming out of DOC, they look at that very seriously because they worry about homelessness and obviously doing that transition as you were talking about and doing it, in the most thoughtful way possible. I mean, just plunking them at the homeless shelter is not great. The SVPs that have gotten probation, they have all gotten 2 years work release out of the county jail, so that's the way they start their sentence. And so there's a long period of monitoring them and watching them and then transitioning them out of the work release program. And I would say that Ms. Booth's right, most of the SVPs do go to prison initially.
And when they're at these transition houses, are they allowed to, I would think, to have a job and?
They're required to in the halfway houses, yes, and parole pretty regularly. My experience with SVPs coming out of prison is they are using GPS pretty regularly. The way that parole has that set up is that they have their own dispatch center, so it is a 24/7 center. GPS is good technology, it's not great technology, and it tends to make people feel like it will act as if it's going to stop something from happening. What it does get used for is to know that someone was in that location, something bad happened there, and it can narrow down who might have been responsible for that.
But it's not, could it be real time? So let's say.
It is real time. It's how you respond to that, the accuracy of it, and then what resources you can dispatch to that.
Right.
So, I mean, one of the things that's fairly fragmented is that connection between corrections and law enforcement and say 911. When you call 911, you have a 3 or 4 minute response time in Boulder, something like that. If those resources are connected, then you have that kind of response. It's pretty rare that those resources are connected. Parole pretty much does this on their own. We have done there's been some special discussions recently around doing something more enhanced than that with SVPs coming out. Nothing formalized. And you all were asking, what do we do at the local or state level? I think that there's a lot of resources and a lot of interest in doing this in the most thoughtful way possible in Boulder. So I think creating a group or tasking a group to look at this and bring something back to you with options might be a way to go. Because there is technology out there. You just have to bring the resources together to make sure when we say it's real time and we're monitoring it 24/7, that we actually are doing that and not a parole officer coming here from 20 or 30 minutes away and trying to figure out what's going on.
So let's say you had an individual that was a repeated offender and attacked children. And so you wouldn't want that individual anywhere close to a daycare or to a school.
Correct.
So is some of that enhanced technology that
Yes.
you might be considering, would start buzzing or something like that if that individual approaches where a daycare or a
Yeah.
school is?
The technology is such that you can create inclusion and exclusion zones. Now, I will tell you, when we do use GPS, we use a lot of resources chasing down, they came too close to a zone, or a loose battery, or a battery recharge, or something called drift. Unfortunately, the GPS technology, your phone has better GPS technology than the units that we have available to us right now. Your phones triangulate through cell towers and through satellites, at least 2 satellites. We oftentimes only have 1 satellite doing that with GPS. It's getting better all the time, but it's amazing that your iPhone actually, when you're driving and using Google Maps, is actually better oftentimes than the GPS we have for a variety of reasons. It's on the ankle. Indoors, it doesn't work. You've got to use cell towers instead. I mean, there's a lot of different nuances to it that cause it not to be as accurate, and it's not like CSI. And we all want to believe it's like CSI. It's not that way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're next, but can I just jump in? Is the technology you're talking about, is this a problem that resources can solve, or just the technology is not that advanced?
It's getting better. I mean, I think it's the human element and connecting resources. For instance, the parole officer driving from, Westminster that's 30 minutes away. They're not going to. GPS is not going to stop somebody from doing something they are deliberately going to do. It will not stop a murder. It will not stop a robbery. It will tell you that they were there, and for some people, it's a deterrent. They know that somebody's watching. The key is that you have to be watching, and you have to be checking on that. And so bringing the resources together with corrections and law enforcement and talking about what a community can do, in my view, is probably a good public policy. The other thing that hasn't been said tonight is 75% of all sex offenders are granted probation off the bat. 93% around this country get out of prison someday, so they're not going away forever. They're all coming back. It's how do they come back? How do they land back into a community? And how do you do that in the most safe, thoughtful way?
Say more about this idea that we should set a group. Figure this out,
there are
like-
jurisdictions where they, with corrections, probation, parole, law enforcement, they get together and they share the information on these very high-risk people where, if I leave at 5 o'clock today from my office, it passes over to law enforcement and their dispatch. Then they get the alerts, guys at, 20th and Canyon, and that's an exclusion zone. They can dispatch a car there, contact him, and have a discussion and figure out, is he supposed to be here and why is he here? As opposed to Westminster parole officer driving 30 minutes up here to try to figure out where this guy's at. So there are ways to partner. It may be more resources for local police, dispatch, and all of that, but there are ways to use the technology and human capability, which is really important. We over-rely on technology, use the resources and the things we do well in a thoughtful way.
So I want to get back to this resources question. Buying for state-of-the-art GPS trackers, I don't think is outside of something that Boulder could budget for. But presumably those GPS trackers are currently purchased through the, is it the Prison Diversion Fund?
So parole, usually they're large companies that lease them. It's much because the technology changes so fast, they're usually leased at a daily price. And then a contract's made around that price, and then as the units get better, smaller, more efficient, better batteries, they get upgraded.
Okay, and so the funding is from the state, and presumably we heard that the Prison Diversion Fund is probably underfunded relative to what the communities that are served by these organizations would like to see. Would you agree with that?
I don't know parole's budget. I think that they have pretty good resources to put people into treatment and to do GPS, and I think that they're using GPS on all the SVPs as long as they have them under their supervision. There's a whole nother category of SVPs that aren't under any supervision at this point in time because the laws have been in place so long. But I mean, that would be a discussion to have with them. I mean, could there be a city parole partnership where you say, here's 5 of these units, anytime one of these guys comes out, put them on, ask the parole board to make it a condition. So we can know where they're at. I mean, that can be asked, and if it's a resource issue, then there's a potential solution there. I think you got to get everybody in the room, though, to find out what the limitations are and what can a municipality do to influence parole. On the probation side, you have a judge that's retained by the people that makes every single one of these decisions. So that judge is accountable, obviously, to the people as well. And we try to figure out who can we manage in the community and who needs to go to prison.
So I'd like to learn more about halfway houses. How many are there?
2.
One in Boulder and one in
One in
Longmont?
Boulder, one in
How big
Longmont,
is-
one on Canyon, and one on Main Street in Longmont,
Okay, where on Canyon?
23rd.
23rd and Canyon, that's interesting. And how many people reside there?
I'm guessing 65 offenders, either diversion that a judge is allowed to go there and not go to prison, or people coming back from prison.
Got it, 65. And is there a reason why the sexually violent prisoners aren't housed there when they come out?
I think, I don't know the answer to that. That would be a parole question. If they don't have what they would consider to be a stable place to go, then they're going to look at that. They don't want them to parole homeless, obviously. So if they have a residence to go to, if they have family members here, somebody who will let them live there, then, they may look at that as a more viable option and not use that bed for someone who actually has a place to go.
Okay, but now, I just want to go to the Christopher Lawyer case, if I can, to make sure I understand the chain of events. So we know he committed a crime against a child, and then he committed a crime against a stranger, and he went to prison for those. He happens to be from Boulder, and he has family in Boulder and returned, and then that fell apart for whatever reason. So would it be an option for, instead of shelter beds, for these SVPs to be prioritized to put into a halfway house? And is there supervision at that halfway house?
Yes. Under my review of what I know about the case, that would have been an option for parole to consider.
Got it. And so it seems like maybe we need to work better with parole, is one of the messages I'm getting, is that our community and parole need to understand these mechanisms a little better. Now, the police may already do that, but it sounds like we had this elevated now to a council level, and we need to really get clear on what kind of relationships can we set up between parole, the people who manage the halfway house. Is that under parole's management?
It's a contract that's actually bid for through Boulder County Community Corrections. So it's a bid that comes up every 5 years. It's a performance-based contract. There's a huge RFP process. It's a multi-million-dollar contract. So, there's a lot that goes into that.
Okay, and there is one more piece that I wanted to understand based on what you described for the way that an SVP will pass through the system. So you said that they go to a 2-year work release program, right? And is that through the county jail?
That's correct.
But prior to that, they were incarcerated somewhere else?
They could have been. So I don't know that this is SVP, but there's, Katarina spoke to kind of some of these hybrid sentences that her office does where they go to prison for a period of time and then they come back to probation. So you could go to prison on a determinate sentence, get probation for life, and as a condition of that, go to work release for 2 years out of the county jail. And so we get offenders back that way. 2 SVPs in my 29 years in the department, and since all this, that I remember actually got probation and work release and did not go to prison. So that was the plan for them.
I see.
Our policy when they're an SVP and probation's on the table is we ask for 2 years work release as a way to stabilize, contain, figure out what we have, and then move forward from there. We figure it's one of the safest settings we can do in the community.
Got it. And would it be your professional judgment that the SVPs that we have in our community would get better treatment if they were in the halfway house than if they were in the shelter as far as the supervision goes?
So the halfway house does provide supervision, and I can't speak to the size of parole caseloads. I will tell you my officers are capped at 25 offenders, so that's how they spend 40 hours a week of their lives is on those 25 offenders. We use the halfway house, and they supplement some of the things that we do, but mostly it's educational, vocational, monitoring things like drug and alcohol stuff, curfews and things like that. They are in the field, as my officers are, verifying that they're at places like that. The flip side of it is that you have a shelter that has really amazing programming, that really is connected with the community, and in the long term may do a better job of integrating this person in a safe way. And we partner really well with the shelter. We work very closely with them. So it depends on the risk factors that person poses. If it's more of a containment issue and we don't trust them, perhaps the halfway house versus how are we going to do this in a successful way that this person gets integrated into the community in a safe way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
This touches on a concern that we'll come back to later, but maybe you can answer some of this. I'm sorry to take up a bunch of questioning. This will be my last question, is when I hear about sexually violent predators in the population at the shelter, it raises questions and concerns about the safety of other people who are in the shelter. Do you have anything to say about that?
I don't know of any incidences that have happened with SVPs in the shelter. One of the misnomers about the SVP is it excludes misdemeanors. Some of our highest risk people engage in misdemeanor sexual assaults and assaults, but they avoid, because one of the mistakes with the SVP classification is that it starts off being offense-based. There is no relationship between the offense and the risk a person poses in the community. What they did does not speak to what we know about actuarial risk. So if it's a misdemeanor, they never even go through this process. So that's a big problem with the assessment. The other problem with the assessment is there's pieces of it that are subjective, and so it depends on the judge or the parole board making the finding about how that relationship started. And it largely ignores some of the things that really are very scientific and evidence-based. We treat an SVP the same as we treat any offender coming out on probation. We watch them very closely in the beginning. We use polygraph. We use lots of monitoring and containment until we get a track record of them being accountable and honest to us, independent of what the assessments say, because we treat them all pretty high risk in the beginning.
Thank you.
There's a cue, but can you just, that sentence that you said about how a bunch of them commit misdemeanor crimes seems at odds. Can you explain that again, because I didn't get it?
Sure. So this for in general criminal justice and criminology, people who commit misdemeanors are sometimes the highest risk to recidivate out there. So someone who commits, for instance, the highest recidivism rate for any sex offender population are exposers and peepers. They're going to do it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. A person who is interfamilial that molested a child, one of the lower risk populations. Now, they may have started that relationship, and it may have been found that the judge decided that they started that relationship to get access to that child, which may put them in the SVP category. But those are the kind of nuances that we try to look at, and the judge is trying to sort out at sentencing, and hopefully that the parole board is trying to figure out down the road. Does that make sense?
That helps. Mary and then Bob.
Simple question?
It's a simple question. Thank you for coming out tonight. My question has to do with just if when we're going to put together a set of partners, a team to come up with a good plan for what to do with sexually violent predators in our community, who would be at the table?
DA representative, public defender representative, law enforcement, a judge, housing people, so the homeless shelter, how are we going to do this? Employment people, probation should be at the table because you never know if we're going to be involved or not. Vocational people, all of those people should be at the table because each of them bring different expertise to the table, and if the job is to safely land this person in the community and give them the best chance to create a lifestyle that's incompatible with offending, you need a very broad, comprehensive approach to it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Bob and then Jan.
It sounds like we're being discouraged, at least by some of your colleagues, from passing exclusion zones, and we'll talk about those later on. So I want to talk a little bit about your experience, or the experience of your colleagues. You've been in the business for a long time, so presumably you have colleagues around the state who have dealt with the cities that have exclusion zones. What has been your experience or their experience with respect to those cities? Is it worse, better, neutral?
So locally, I know that it's created problems because they do go underground. I actually do some consulting on this topic because Colorado actually, I know there's concerns. Colorado is actually considered to be one of the forerunners in this management practice. I mean, we chose indeterminate sentencing versus civil commitment, for instance. We have one of the most advanced assessment processes that, out there. We have an evaluation and a report that we write for the judge and everybody to look at. It's a very in-depth look at this person and their risk factors, so we do that very well. California came up as an example. By way of example, the city of San Francisco created an exclusion zone, and the exclusion zone basically made it impossible for a sex offender to reside anywhere legally in the entire city. With one exception, there was a dump that they could reside in, but then the EPA banned the dump, condemned the dump, and they couldn't sleep there any longer. So San Francisco's had to create a series of day centers where these guys just go out at night, they sleep wherever because they can't find a legal place to sleep, and then they come to the day centers, which again are within the exclusion zone, but they're during the daytime. to give them something to do, to keep track of them. So some of these policies create more problems. The other thing that I would say about residence restrictions is you want to be careful with the people who are charged with managing these offenders and watching them, how they spend their time. So if you do too much GPS on too many people, guess what they do? All they do is watch the screen and respond to violations. If you create residency restrictions where all my officers do is go out and continue to look at residences that might be 500 feet or 1,000 feet away and get on Google Earth and try to figure that out, then that's what they're doing for the day. They're not following people around that might be dangerous or we might be concerned about. We're trying to land people back in the community. So there's consequences to every decision.
And so that was a great segue to my second question. And this really kind of tees up for what Sam was talking about. You know, we're talking a little bit about exclusion zones. What if we created an inclusion zone, which is you only may live at the halfway house in Boulder? You can live, that's the only place you can live in Boulder, and that's where we want you to be. And this is kind of a mixed bag of both your professional opinion, but maybe Tom has an opinion about that, whether that would be enforceable. But how do you feel about that?
There are such things as inclusion zones.
Okay.
And, you know, parole can limit, probation through a judge's order can limit a person's liberties. Where you reside and who you associate with is a constitutional right. That's debated regularly around how much we can do. When they're in the system, pretty much it's about public safety, and the court can impinge on that considerably, as can the parole board. So we can tell them where to live and do that. Are they on forever and we can do that? No. So the goal is you do that for a period of time while you get services in place and hopefully reduce their risk, and then you gradually let them run their own lives. But in theory, yes, you can do that. I mean, we do it all the time. We limit people where they can go. I mean, when they're in work release, we say you can go here, you can go there. You know, if you're caught here, you're in trouble. You know, you're allowed to go to work. We try to keep them away from victims, because when you leave an offender in the same community as a victim, you want that victim to be able to go on with their life. But also, this person needs a fair chance to try to be successful under probation or parole.
Okay,
so, I mean, it's difficult, but you can do it technologically.
Okay, thanks.
Jan?
Hi. I've got two simple questions. Is that on? What percentage of the SBCs actually get jobs? Is the first one. The second one, I may have missed it. The halfway house, do they stay open during the day? So are the people there allowed to stay during the day?
So anyone who's on probation and on parole, unless they are unable to work, are technically required to be working. So they go out and they get jobs. We have 140 sex offenders on probation on any given day. The vast majority have jobs. Some are on disability, some are in their 80s because we've had them for 2 decades already. You know, and they're on Social Security. I mean, it's the gamut, but generally the idea is that you're gainfully employed, you're helping pay for this transition back into the community, and it keeps you busy for 30, 40 hours a week, and that's a good thing, you know, for 1,000 reasons. The halfway house is open during the day. They're required to have a job there. They actually pay a portion of their rate there every day, so they have to pay that every day. There's security staff there. When they leave the halfway house, they do point-to-point check-ins. So they leave the halfway house, they call from, you know, their employers and say, I'm at work until 4 p.m. Then they can verify that during the day. When they're at the halfway house, they're there. They're allowed to go to treatment, allowed to do other activities that they were ordered to do by the parole board or by the judge.
Okay, but they're not banned from the facility during the day?
No, it depends on their shift. If they had the graveyard shift, they're going to be there during the day.
I see, okay. And then just a follow-up, in Tom's statistics, it said that we have 44 here with no, well, they aren't the SVPs, but sex offenders with no address.
Yes.
How, in your experience, do those people have jobs?
Many of them, so we have a population that are homeless and have part-time jobs. They do day labor. They do anything they can to make ends meet. So, I mean, the ones that we have on supervision, we require them to have jobs, and the vast majority do.
And do you think they have not reported their address, or are they really sleeping on the streets?
We believe the ones that we have, that we do know that they truly are homeless and reporting that way, because we try to verify it. And we work really closely with BPD about, is this legit or is this guy, you know, because we don't want them to have a residence that we don't know about. That's a bad situation. So I can't speak for parole, but we have a pretty good idea of where people are living, and we can verify. I mean, you can tell when someone's homeless too. I mean, if they say they're homeless and they're showering every day, I mean, there's things you can look for.
Okay, thank you.
Matt?
Well, just one follow-up. A couple of people have mentioned, you just talked about kind of convening a group together. Has that happened at any other county?
It actually, like I said, I do some work around the country, and actually it's one of the things that comes out is people get concerned, as you all have, and say, look, this is more complicated than it looks like just creating an ordinance. What can we do? Let's understand the resources that we can bring to bear on this. Maybe you all have a role in that, and figure out how do we do the best we can with what we have, because they are going to come out. And I will tell you, if they get sentenced out of Boulder County and they don't have any other place to go, they're probably going to get put back in Boulder County by parole, in the parole board. So can we do that in a more thoughtful way, and can we do it in a better way? Yes. And a group of people can do that, and they are. I mean, there are jurisdictions that are working very closely at trying to do this in a thoughtful way as possible and not creating ordinances that feel good tonight, but don't really do anything to further public safety.
Since Boulder County manages much of this, as they should, has the county tried to convene people, not just in the city of Boulder, but Longmont, obviously, and the other communities?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much the county side of it, they don't do a lot in the criminal justice area other than supervising bond for adults generally until they're convicted and then the system takes over. We probably could do it, but we work very closely with parole because we get these hybrid sentences. Would we work with cities? We want to. I mean, we work with the shelter. I mean, we look for how do we do this in the most thoughtful way. We have a great partnership with the shelter. We work very closely with them. Any entity that can help us do a better job with this population and give them a chance to be safe and successful in the community, we're going to do.
Okay, thanks.
Did you mention that there are communities that are doing what you were suggesting well? Are there any in Colorado?
So there's a center called the Center for Sex Offender Management, and they actually have a checklist that you can look at. How are we as a community and a system managing sex offenders? And then they have suggestions about convening groups and creating task forces and things like that to look at it. And they actually do some work around doing that and actually help communities do that. CSOM, CSOM.org. Tons of information there, but that's their public policy is to help jurisdictions do a better job, and they'll do an assessment, a community assessment. What do you have in place, and then what do we know? What does the research tell us about what you can do better?
Oh, okay. Sam, did you have?
Yeah. Just a few more GPS questions because I don't think I tracked the answers as well as I could have. While you have your people paying attention to GPS location, if something goes off, they may hear some person on probation, right, at this point?
That's correct.
No, I'm sorry, parole. I'm going to talk about people who are on parole. So after prison,
right,
they're on parole. They have limitations on where they can go, and they violate those limitations. Does somebody from your office go?
No.
Parole go?
Parole, they have a dispatch center, so the alert from the company that monitors it, they do a little bit of investigation, try to figure out what's going on. They alert the parole dispatch center. The parole dispatch center has someone on 24/7 that responds, gets the information from the tracking company, and then figures out, is this someone breaching a zone? Are they in the zone? Is it a technical problem? And then they figure out how to respond to that.
Got it. And what's the practice of working with law enforcement on that? I mean, so you made it sound like these parole officers are only on duty a certain amount of time during each day. Is that correct?
So their supervising officer may be on duty, but with parole, they do have a dispatch center, and they do have 24/7.
Sure, from the dispatch center.
Right, so they would dispatch someone here, or a parole officer that lives in Boulder County would pick it up or something. I mean, the comparison I try to make for people, because people ask for GPS a lot in a lot of different cases, stalking cases, DV cases, the comparison is don't compare it in most jurisdictions to 911. It's not that kind of response.
Right.
Could it be? Yes. I mean, if things are done correctly, but it's not in most places.
Could we, if we chose to pick people who had felonies of a high enough grade who have these GPSs on, could we choose to have dispatch inform our officers as well as the parole officers?
So parole would control the contract at this point in time, or if it were through my office, we would control the contract, but we decide who gets notified. Victims, which officer in my department gets notified, we control that piece. So they would be able, the technology exists to notify, to do real-time notification.
Okay, and would you have an objection to notifying the police if there were some?
Not at all.
Not at all?
If my philosophy, we only have a handful of people on GPS at any given time because it's all we can legitimately do and say we're going to do the best we can. So we have a handful on, and we do the best we can to do the 24/7 coverage. But we have on occasion partnered with BPD or Longmont PD to say we've got this guy. Can you, we call them and say, can you dispatch someone to this location? So that does happen. It's not routine. It's not in policy. We do it when we have really concerning people.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Tom, who's next?
Greg Testa.
Oh,
It's a
the
whole
chief.
bunch of Gregs.
Okay.
Hi, good evening, Council. Greg Testa. Sam, to answer your question, or to further talk about what Greg just said, that does happen from time to time, where probation and parole do call us and say, can you follow up? We're getting an alert that we're concerned about. Would you send an officer to figure out what happens? So, a lot of times, the parole or probation officer will simply just call the offender and say, I'm getting an alert or an alarm that says you're in an exclusionary zone. What are you doing? So there's a lot of different ways that they can look at that and try and address or intervene. I just wanted to say a few comments. I've talked to council before about SVBs and sex offenders, and I've talked to some of you individually. And I just wanted to provide some additional statistics from what Tom had presented. So out of the 4 SVPs that are currently registered in the city of Boulder, 3 are at the shelter, and the 4th one is at a fixed address. So from a law enforcement perspective, we're very happy that all 4 of those individuals have a roof over their head and they have an address attached to them, and they're not living on the street. So for City of Boulder numbers, Greg had mentioned that they have 140, I think he said probationary sex offenders that they track. But for City of Boulder numbers, 7 of our sex offenders out of the 122 are on parole, and 28 are on probation. Out of the 122, 87 have no restrictions. In other words, they're not on parole, they're not on probation. Their only requirement is that they have to register based on Colorado state law. But otherwise, they have no restrictions. They can come and go and do whatever they'd like to do. We have a 98% compliance rate currently with our sex offenders, including SVPs, in terms of them registering and coming in when they're supposed to. Currently, out of the 122 registered sex offenders, we have active warrants for 2 of them for failing to register. We don't know where they're at. And I think...
So, Chief Testa, what do you do in that kind of case? I mean, do you just contact family, known friends? How do you...
So those cases are managed like any other investigation. They have 5 days to register. If they haven't registered, we move quickly, write an affidavit, take it before a judge, get a warrant signed, and then try and investigate and figure out where they're at and have them arrested and picked up.
And how do you know, are you informed by the parole board or the probation officer?
They have to, either they come in on their required time frame to register, or if they change address and we know that they've changed address and they haven't registered, then those are conditions that would allow us to move forward and get and apply for a warrant.
So, Chief Testa, Katerina, I believe, said that that when that happens, they call CBI. Is that, what does CBI stand for?
So CBI is Colorado Bureau of Investigation.
Okay, so go ahead.
So the process there is, we may not know, So we know who is registered in the city of Boulder, right? Because we keep our own registration and our own records. But we don't know who's registered in Weld County or Greeley or Pueblo or Colorado Springs. But the Colorado Bureau of Investigation manages that larger database. So that's a resource to go to figure out if we're looking for person X, to find out whether they have re-registered in another location.
And so if they haven't registered in another location, then that is what's referred to as an inaccurate registry, is that?
Right, it's a violation of failing to register.
Okay.
So for us, it would be that they failed to register in the city of Boulder within their time frame, then we would move to get a warrant. If we found out that they moved to Colorado Springs and registered, then that's fine. As long as they moved to Colorado Springs and they registered within the 5-day time frame, now they're in the jurisdiction of Colorado Springs.
So there was also a claim that if you require, or if you have too many exclusion zones, folks won't register and they'll go underground. So does that then mean that, is that the same as going underground, basically failing to register and not finding them registered somewhere else?
You could consider it being kind of an absconder of the law. In other words, we don't know where you're at, you've fled, and we have no idea where you're at. The term is loosely used, but we also would consider that if somebody is living on the street and they don't have a roof over their head and there's not a fixed address, then we really don't know where they're at until we check up on them. You know, for obvious reasons and what's been stated many times tonight, there is consistency amongst law enforcement that we believe it's preferred to have sex offenders with a roof over their head and an address for obvious reasons. There's some structure there. We know where they're at. There's more likely that we can follow up, we can find them, rather than having somebody on the street. Idle time for somebody, as we all know, is not a good thing. And opportunities to commit crimes, not necessarily sex offenses, can come and go. And so just for common sense reasons, having somebody in that type of a housing situation provides more structure.
Thank you.
Aaron.
So, thanks for being here, Chief Testa. Be interested to hear you respond to Greg Brown's points or ideas about more coordination between the probation and parole officers and the city police force. Is that something you all would be open to? Do you feel like it's a practical, implementable kind of thing?
I'm interested in Greg's ideas, and I think that it certainly can further a conversation and bring about probably more consistency and efficiency in the system. I don't think that we limit it to just law enforcement, as I think he suggested. I think we can broaden it to bring in maybe some other perspectives that are not law enforcement. I think there's value in doing that. And I'm interested in learning more about that. As he was talking about that, I was thinking, so, you know, if we have somebody who is a parolee, okay, who's gotten out of prison, they're on parole, the state or the parole officer has to be open to input as to how the management of that person goes. Because if they're not, in that circumstance, it's a moot point. We can all provide suggestions and ideas, but if they're not open to that, then we've gotten nowhere.
And that was going to be my next question, because we don't have anyone from parole, you know, who does parole here tonight. You know, whether you think, I mean, from working with them in the past, they might be open for more of a collaborative relationship where maybe we're supporting some of the work that they're doing, but maybe they're also willing to take input about exclusion areas, say, for an SVP.
I don't want to speak for them, but I certainly think that I used to have in previous assignments lots more interaction and partnership with them. I think that they would be open to that, to at least being a part of this and listening to suggestions. Certainly with Christopher Lawyer, the parole officer was very concerned about and very interested in the community's concerns and wanting to accommodate as best as possible.
Okay, and that's good to know. But then, of course, there's only a certain amount of time that an SVP would be on parole, and then after that, do we have any of the 4 who are currently resident who are unsupervised who've passed that phase?
I believe they're all supervised.
And on parole or different kinds?
Is that right?
I'm not sure on the other 3 if they are on parole or probation at this time. And just because they are on parole or probation doesn't mean it's because of that sex offense. It could be for
So who is that?
She works for the police department.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
You
Colonel LeBlanc, our police department public information officer.
Great, thank you. Do you mind just repeating, summing that up for the record on the microphone?
Yeah, so so the city of Boulder currently has 4 sexually violent predators. We know for sure that Christopher Lawyer is being supervised. He's on parole. I'm unsure about the other 3, and it's our understanding on checking that Christopher Lawyer is the only SVP that currently has a GPS.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
Okay. We've just been interrupting you. Did you finish what you wanted to?
I did, thank you.
Okay. I think we're good for now, although we may have more questions.
And Suzanne, did you want to hear from Greg Harms? You had asked that we ask him to invite him to talk.
Yeah, sure, that'd be great, Greg.
Greg, would you mind coming forward?
I thought you should hear from the 3rd Greg tonight. So I was just asked quickly to respond to the question of safety with SVP staying at the shelter. And just wanted to say that this shelter is a really safe place. And we don't really concern ourselves with who's going to be there. We set up policies and procedures and practices and training because we don't know who's going to come through the door every night. So we assume that everybody could be potentially a problem. So we put policies and procedures in place so that people don't become a problem. So when an SVP is at the shelter, it's not really any different than any other day at the shelter. That's our take on the safety issue.
Okay, we have some questions, Ed.
Greg, thanks for coming. I think there's 3 sexually violent predators who are at the shelter right now, and I think we heard earlier that they're in actually 3 different programs of the shelter. Can you explain each of those programs and what the exit strategy is for each of those?
I can, although it's probably all going to change here in about 4 weeks. So the new homeless plan is going to dictate using the shelter in different ways. Right now we have what we call our transition program. We have our first step program, which is essentially the wait list for the transition program, and then we have our summer bed program. And so the summer bed program has the lowest hurdles. You just have to be able to show up for an intake interview and have to be committed to being clean and sober. The transition program and the first step program have income requirements on top of that, so it's a little higher hurdle. And once you get into the transition program, then you are assigned a case manager and you have those resources as well. So you can be in any one of those 3 programs right now at the shelter.
So as I understand it, we have SVPs in each of these 3 programs right now. Are there time limits with respect to each of these programs, how long they can stay at the shelter?
Yes. The time limit for the summer bed program is September 30th, the end of our summer season. The transition program and the first step program right now have 9-month limitations. Again, all of this is going to probably change come October 1st with the new homeless plan. Mm-hmm.
Assuming, just set aside the change for a second, so the SVP that's in the first step program, he's got to get out of there by September 30th, unless he qualifies for one of these other programs.
Anybody who's in our summer bed program either has to qualify for one of our other programs. Actually, what's going to happen is everybody's going to start going through the coordinated entry process, and so there's going to be new criteria for who gets to stay at the shelter.
Okay.
So the apple cart's going to get tossed completely up in the air come October 1.
So maybe these are unfair questions because you're in transition, but can you give us some historical perspective? I know you've headed the shelter for a long, long time. Is 3 sexually violent predators residents of the shelter historically high, kind of average, kind of low? Like, you know, if you had to do the average over the last 10 years, you know, how many SVPs do you have at any given time in the shelter, on average?
3 is unusual.
They're unusually high?
Unusually high, yeah. Usually, we don't have any. Often, we have 1 and sometimes 2. I can't recall ever having 3 at the shelter. But we've been housing SVPs, well, since the shelter opened. So I've been through 3 or 4 community meetings around SVP notifications going back to the late 90s. So we've been doing it for a long time, but 3 is unusual.
Okay, thanks, Greg.
We have Jan and then Sam.
These 3 that are there now, are you familiar with what they do during the day? Are they looking for jobs?
We don't monitor their behavior during the day.
Okay. Now, are they able to stay during the day, or do they have to leave?
They have to leave.
They have to leave. So that is a difference then between the halfway house and the shelter. And do you know anything about the halfway house?
I really can't comment on how the halfway house operates.
Okay.
At the shelter, you know, SVPs are treated just like everybody else. They have to be in by 7 p.m. They have to be out by 8 o'clock in the morning. They have to abide by all the rules. They have to do their chore, just like any other resident.
Okay. Thank you.
Sam.
So, Greg, thanks for being here. I think you answered the question about the programs for 2 of the 3. You answered about the first step in transition and the summer bed. What is a parole bed? Can you help us understand what that is a little bit?
So we have set aside some beds for people coming out of incarceration, so either probation or parole beds. So it's essentially a reentry program where we set aside a bed for people coming out of incarceration. We're paid a small fee to hold that bed open for somebody who may be coming out of DOC or the local jail. If we don't have anybody to fill that spot, we fill that bed with somebody else. But it's a reentry program, as Greg Brown was talking about, of, you know, the evidence is clear that releasing people to the streets is not the best solution for good results. So we worked with both the local jail and DOC to try to make sure that if people are being released back to Boulder, they are not being released to the streets.
Mm-hmm. And what's the duration of time for someone who gets into a parole bed? I mean, do you hold them during the summer, for instance? Looks like the answer is yes from Mr. Lawyer, but what happens during the sheltering season?
We run those reentry programs year-round, and people can stay in those reentry beds. I think the average stay is probably 30 days, if I were to guess. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but
How many are there?
it varies. So, I think probably now we have 2 or 3. It's gone up to 7 or 8 probably at some point. It really just depends how many people are being released to our community and how many requests we get from, you know, either the treatment court or DOC for those particular beds. Sometimes it's none. I think the max I've seen is 8 or 9.
This is probably an indelicate question, but because we have a shelter and we have parole beds, are we more likely to get parolees or from the parole board?
I think you'd have to ask the parole board that, but the folks who we are serving are already in our community. I mean, these people were released back into Boulder County.
So that there's not a cause and effect, it's people that are coming back to us because they are from here?
I don't think the parole board uses the shelter as a criteria. I mean, I think it's about where people committed their crimes, about where people have resources like family members, and those are the determinants for where they get released, but these guys could probably answer that better than I.
I was just curious. I assume that's on people's mind. Any other questions for Greg? Thank you very much for being here. That's very helpful. So is
That's
that,
all I have.
okay, so maybe we should let the public speak, eh? How many folks do we have signed up?
We have 6 people.
6 people. Thank you for your patience. I hope you found that useful as well. Each person will have 3 minutes. If you could start with your name and address, that would be great. And we will project the list. All right, Allie Catherine.
Good evening. I am Allie Catherine Wild. I live at 311 Pearl, number 8. That's at the west end of town. That is public housing. And I come from a neighborhood of poor people who some might say we do not organize well. So I have public housing. There are different types of public housing. There's Section 8, there's Section 8 vouchers, project-based Section 8, whatever. So I have project-based Section 8. And it happens to be that I live next door to a guy who raped somebody in our building. So I thought I'd talk about what it is and how it is to live next door to somebody who I believe has raped. Now, the person who was raped was interviewed by the police, and I'm sorry to say, and you might consider this prejudicial also, that some people have more credibility than others when speaking about their experience. And so the woman who I strongly believe was raped is one of those less credible witnesses. So it's not just a product of people not being able to organize well, they can't even represent themselves well. And I do believe I live next door to a rapist, and I'm telling you, it's a difficult situation. I don't like it. But again, he's my neighbor, and you think that the interconnectedness will allow a person to fortify their life. But I've lived there 3 years, and I can tell you that my neighbor has progressively gotten worse. One of the most surprising things that I came here with strong words, like, oh, I'm going to go say this. But of course, when I hear people talk, I feel better about being educated. And one of the things that I've learned from Greg, I guess he's not here anymore, he said that one of the difficulties that happens, the highest risk people that are in the community, and maybe your memory is better than mine, are people who do misdemeanors. And I think that's exceptional because that's been my experience. I'm stalked by this guy. And I can't even claim that because it's denied so much. I went to the judge, and the judge says, well, it doesn't pass the legal standard of stalking, and so we're going to refuse this. You can't have a order of protection. When I call the police tell me, you know what? This guy has a right to get high and drunk and smoke. And, in public housing, that's not supposed to be allowed. But, can you go to mediation? What type of problem? We can't, from my end of things, my problem isn't addressed well, and it's not solved. And people don't take concern seriously enough to have it even be considered a misdemeanor. So I'm sorry I only get 3 minutes because you know what? I think I'm one of the few who get to speak as a rape survivor who lived next door to a rapist who also wants to facilitate community engagement through education. Thank you for your time.
Hang on a second, please.
I just wanted you, so you are limited to 3 minutes here, but you can write us as long an email as you choose to compose, and we'll read it. So I'm just inviting you, if you so choose and want to add some more detail to that story, we'd be happy to hear from you.
The story, the progress that I was trying to think of is how to ask good questions, because there's a lot of capability here, and questions serve people who come together and want to put their best forward. And I don't have good questions enough yet.
Okay, but I'm just inviting.
Thank you for your
Yeah, well,
thanks.
betcha. Heidi Davis. And after Heidi, we'll have Patricia.
Hello. Hello, I'm Heidi. I don't want to tell you where I live because I don't want anyone
That's
coming
fine.
over. But I live next to the homeless shelter. So I think what I gathered tonight is I don't think anyone wants to, say, put sexually violent predators on the streets. I don't want that. I don't think anyone in the community would want that. My issue is that they are being housed at the homeless shelter. And sorry, Greg, but I don't think it's the right spot for them. I think there's not the supervision. I don't understand why they're not at the halfway house. And I'm sure they have electricity. I'm sure they can charge the monitors there. So I don't see what the argument for having them at the homeless shelter is. I feel like there's enough homeless people in the community that need beds. And the homeless shelter, from what I've heard from Greg when we spoke on the phone, in the winter, you don't need to be clean and sober. There's not weapons check. It's kind of who show up and get a bed kind of deal. And I just think that since the homeless shelter is in a community. There's so many children up there, and I know we've been speaking about the rights of the SVPs, but what about the rights of the children and the women and the people who live up there and want to feel safe? I know statistically, you say, they don't necessarily reoffend in the area they're living. That doesn't mean much to the person that gets offended. Or, one is too many, in my opinion. I think, it just is common sense that we would offer housing to these SVPs in a shelter or in a halfway house or somewhere where they're monitored. They get the resources to come back into society. And I don't think that's the homeless shelter. I just don't. I don't think sending them out at 7 in the morning with no accountability or to know, honestly, they're coming into our neighborhoods. They're pitching, not necessarily all the SVPs, but they're, the homeless are pitching tents in our little park. We have a lot of drug paraphernalia all over the place. There's the overflow. So when they are kicked out of the homeless shelter, that's where they're coming. And I just don't think it's a safe environment. I don't think community and sexually violent predators should be next door to each other. It's a temptation. If I'm trying to lose weight, I don't move into an ice cream store. So I just think it's just really common sense to offer the proper kind of monitoring housing for these individuals. And I'm not saying put them on the street or under the bridges. I'm not saying that.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Heidi. Patricia? And then Michael.
My name is Patricia DeAngelis Ratner. I live in North Boulder. I'm on the committee for a Safe North Boulder I helped with submitting the petition. Thank you for looking into this issue. I've learned a lot tonight too, and I gotta tell you, I'm more afraid than I was 3 months ago when we started this. A lot of us had no idea that Mr. Harms has now invited 2 other SVPs to live in that homeless shelter. And, shame on you. I got to tell you didn't know there's a halfway house in the community? Who is regulating what Mr. Harms does? You have the control over the conditional use permit. I understand maybe you don't want to put the ordinance together. There's a lot of controversy on the ordinance. But who has authority over Mr. Harms and what they're doing at the shelter? Is it you, Mayor? Because clearly he's making decisions for the whole community. There are a majority of residents in North Boulder that are scared stiff, that do not want this designated sexually violent predator person living among young women and children. And over again, what did I hear? There's so few of them. Well, there's so few of them. If there's so few of them, how is it that Boulder and the homeless shelter has 3 of them? It's just unconscionable that you held those meetings when he invited in the first sexually violent predator on his own, because a number of us talked to the board members from the shelter after the last council meeting, and then they admitted to us that Mr. Harns made the decision on his own. He didn't contact or have any discussions with the board members. So what I want to know is, you have the ultimate authority over that conditional use permit. You have the right to tell Mr. Harns today to take all 3 of the sexually violent predators and put them in a place where they can be supervised. It's appalling that this gentleman and the other 2 men or women have been let out of prison, and they basically have free roam in the city of Boulder. At least when we talk to the parole officer in the halfway house, it sounds like there's pretty good, strict supervision of these individuals. They have to have jobs. They have to account for where they are. In the shelter, well, they leave at 7 in the morning, wander all day, and come back at 7 at night. And Mr. Harns stood up here and said, we don't treat a sexually violent predator any differently than we do a homeless person. That is just wrong. You know it's wrong, and you know those people should not be placed in North Boulder, particularly with such a young population of young children and young families. You're giving permitting to the Armory site to go ahead and put in affordable housing, and you want young people to move in, but at the same time, you're going to put them in danger. Please move these guys into the halfway house as soon as you can. Thank you.
I need to remind you not to clap or boo. If you want to agree with somebody, do that, but we want to keep it so that everybody can feel comfortable with whatever opinion they want to express. Michael. Is Michael William here? Okay, how about Sean Enfield? Is that Sean? Yes. Oh, okay.
Good evening. Hi, it's good to be here. Happy to see everyone. I been in Boulder for over 3 years now. Moved from Asheville, North Carolina, where I was homeless, and experienced some of their programs there, like A Hope, which was a day shelter, which unfortunately Boulder does not have. I was asked to come here by Elizabeth, who's in the Boulder County court system, and she's put together a task force for homelessness. And I didn't realize that tonight was mostly about sexual predators, but I could address a few of those comments. Number one, it's kind of interesting these people choose an anonymous type of situation, that they can't actually have anonymity, that they know their names, and that these people are tracked and followed, similar to the Boulder homeless population. Through the Bridge House, Boho, and the Boulder Shelter, these people are tracked, monitored. They know when they check in. This information is gathered by people like Greg. I also have reason to believe he didn't answer a lot of the questions that the city has about the homeless endeavor. I've been exploring the Denver situation, which is through the Denver Rescue Mission, the St. Francis Day Center, the Denver Partnership, and quite a few other organizations. They have the Crossroads Salvation Army, which is an emergency overflow shelter. There are places where these people can meet, gather, create, love, share. They can be seen as people. They are equal. They are not seen as equal in Boulder. These people fly signs to try and alert people to the problem of not seeing human beings, of seeing people for their clothes, what they wear, what they do with their time. These people are visible in Boulder, but now they become invisible. You know why? Because they've had to leave. I have a 14-day ban at the Boulder shelter. I've been going there to eat breakfast, to volunteer my time, to take showers. I had a 5-minute late charge. And 3 or 4 warnings for being 5 minutes late for taking a shower in the morning. They banned me for 14 days. I was upset. I kicked a door, which happens to these people all the time. They get upset, they get triggered. There's trauma, like we all have, and they take it out in the wrong ways, and then they're banned. So now I go to court for what? A public urination charge. Now let me tell you, in a city that has this much money, this many resources, that we can't afford public restrooms along the Boulder Creek path or downtown? Okay, I read an article in the Daily Camera. I'm willing to start a Kickstarter project for a compostable solar toilet. All right, I'm gonna start more platforms, and I will come back and speak about more issues. You can feel free to contact me at skedenfield@icloud.com. I'm working on a special task force between Denver and Boulder partnerships, and I'm open to answer questions after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate you coming. Lynn is next.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lynn Siegel, 538 Dewey. I understand Stan Garnett was saying we should keep sexual recidivism, sexually violent, predator, recidivist, high recidivism rate people at the homeless shelter, and that during the day, as long as we have more police available, and this is once again a situation of why should Boulder have extra police for like 3 people? Why should, it seems like a waste of resources to have to put, if someone is a recidivized situation and they're violent and they're out during the days and they're with a GPS system, who cares about a GPS system? And that was brought up earlier. It doesn't matter. They're going to have committed their crime and go, and not be picked up. The police can't get there in time. So that's not, that doesn't make me feel any better. I'm curious about how curable this disorder really is. And the only person I've heard about that does any of this kind of work is Marshall Rosenberg, and I don't know exactly what, he's saying the origins of problems with people with this problem is that they lack of love in their life, which it just seems to me completely perverse that you would express yourself, by raping someone when you're in need of love. But if there's some way of somehow figuring that out, I'd be curious about it. And I was also curious about lawyer's mom, who's working to solve the core reason behind the problem of sexually violent predation. And I haven't heard anything from Stan Garnett or from any of the community around about core way of solving the actual problem. And I find that fascinating. I'd also say all roads lead to impact fees, because these things are costly. Even if you're going to figure out core problems, you're going to have to spend money for that. And this is a very wealthy community, and they should rise to the occasion.
Thank you, Lynn. Marianne?
Hello, I'm Marianne Gatton, 942 Likens Avenue, so right up in the heart of North Boulder, near the homeless shelter. Thank you for taking the time to look further into this issue. It is really important, and if you've been in the North Boulder area, it is a heavy young family area. I've just spent the last 8 years walking my 2 children to their elementary school bus stop up there. The bus has 2 buses that go through the Dakota Ridge neighborhood for elementary school, and those buses are packed. This is a young community. What I learned today made me more nervous about the SVPs. I had no idea that they weren't monitored. Only 1 out of 3 is monitored. And, you know, the high school, most of those kids are catching the skip to go to school every day at the same time that the homeless shelter is letting out. Also, as we've heard, I don't know if you heard the story online about one of the SVPs being cited at the North Boulder Rec Center in the hot tub with kids. I didn't know if this was real or not, but hearing today that there's no ankle monitor, I guess they can be in the pool with kids at the North Boulder Rec Center. So it's not just in the local community or where they're housed, but you know where they are every day, throughout the day, being unmonitored. And it sounds like this halfway house with at least better supervision is a better place to be. And I did really like what I heard with one of your city council members saying that we want to protect the most vulnerable in this community, and that is our children in these neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that's it, yeah? So with that, we will close the public hearing, and we will turn to council, but thanks again for coming and participating. Does somebody want to start? Go ahead, Bob.
I guess I do have some things to say, but I guess let me ask a procedural question of either you or Tom. Is it our goal this evening to, if it's the will of the council to do something, or pass an ordinance or develop an ordinance, is our goal tonight to give Tom some direction along those lines and then have him bring an ordinance back if that's what most of us want to have done?
Correct.
Okay.
Or something else.
Or something else, okay. Well, I'll start up. I don't think doing nothing is an option here. Like some of the speakers, I'm more concerned now than I was 2 hours ago. It doesn't feel to me like it's very well coordinated. There are a lot of questions tonight that didn't get answered. One of the things I heard tonight that was disturbing is that it sounds like a majority of these SVPs have either attacked strangers or children. And I think those are, as another speaker said, you know, those are the most vulnerable people in our community, children and women who have been attacked by strangers. And so I think it would be relatively easy for us to craft a legally enforceable ordinance that excludes, my preference would be to exclude presence, but maybe that's not permitted, but at a minimum exclude residents near places where children and other people, vulnerable people in our community congregate, schools, parks, as just mentioned, recreation centers. And if we make the distance limit appropriate, it sounds like there'll still be some space for folks to still live. My first choice would be actually to create an inclusion zone and say sexually violent predators in our community must live in the halfway house, period. That would be my first choice.
Hey, excuse me.
If Tom tells us that that's not legally permissible, or that would be subject to a state attack, then I would fall back to exclusion zones around sensitive areas. But that would be my personal preference.
Can I ask a question, though, about that? Do we have any information more about the halfway house?
No.
I mean, okay. And nobody, I mean, just like we're making, oh, yes, please
I don't know
come
if I'm
forward.
out of order by,
No, you're one of our speakers. Come on, come.
but you don't have the authority over the community corrections and the halfway house. That is state controlled and state funded, such that, I mean, you do have some county funding for through the Boulder County Commissioners in the sense of when they're being used as our halfway house as a condition of our jail. It's our work release program. But for example, these SVPs, some of the ones you're talking about, they've come out of DOC. You have no authority. And I know people want to have you to say, go place them at community corrections. You can't. You can't force the parole board to put them over there. And for example, Mr. Lawyer chose not to come transitioning back through community corrections and going to the halfway house because he had family members that he had, and he was paroled to that family member. You can't tell the parole board to put him over at the community corrections despite it might be the right thing or what everybody wants in the room. You just don't have that kind of authority.
It seems that sometimes money talks, because Greg Harms has paid money to house sexually violent predators, and so perhaps we could offer money to the state or whoever, or the county, whoever is running the halfway house, to provide housing for sexually violent predators.
That's right. The halfway house is a privately run facility, and like Mr. Brown said, they have to do their contracts. I think they actually just went through their contract last year, if I'm remembering right. But whether or not they would contract out to have certain beds set aside as, I mean, they do it already, and they're paying when they come through transition, but as a condition of parole would be an additional maybe area to explore if that's possible.
Certainly worth discussing. I have one other thing to say, and I'll yield the microphone. I also did not hear tonight any credible evidence that indicates that creating exclusion zones causes harm. We talked a little bit about that. Tom, I think you've done a great job of providing us advice about where probably the boundary is from a legal standpoint. I don't want to cross that line, but within those legal boundaries, I didn't hear anything tonight that said at least those cities that have created exclusionary zones have worse problems than we do, and so it's something that I would like to try.
Sam was next, and then Jan.
So just to amplify one point that Bob made, I guess I want to thank everyone for coming first. It has been extremely educational. There's a lot that I did not understand about this when we started, and now I get it better. But I still agree with Bob that we need to do something, and we need to take this problem quite seriously, just so that we all up our competency in what's going on here. As I read through what the convictions were for the 4 sexually violent predators who are registered here in Boulder, all of them either attacked a child or a stranger. So we're not talking about the possibility that one of these did something different than that, and that is of great concern. Another point that I want to make right away is much of the conversation we heard is about recidivism rates, and we heard a really important point that very high recidivism rates occur for misdemeanor convictions, and I believe that. I mean, you're not going to be in jail for as long or have it taken as seriously if you're exposing yourself to somebody. However, there's also a severity of the crime to consider as well, and so even if it's a low recidivism rate, but people are raping or otherwise violently attacking other people because they've been classified as a psychopath, that also is a very serious issue that we need to be concerned about. So I guess, Bob, I kind of would love if we could have an inclusion zone around the halfway house, but the problem is that people pass through halfway houses, but the sexually violent predator label stays with them for a long time, as does the requirement to register. So I would love to convene a task force of some kind in which we try and make sure that everyone coming out of the Department of Corrections must go through the halfway house because they will get structure at first, they're less likely to be on the streets later, et cetera, et cetera. So, Christopher Lawyer had family support that didn't last for long enough. I would love to see him have to go through the halfway house program now, because I think that would give him a better chance of success and protect our community better. So I guess I would like to propose a few things that I would like to see. One is exclusion zones. So we've heard that we can create those. I was a bit alarmed to hear that only one of the 4 sexually violent predators has a GPS tracker. I would like to work with parole to understand if we could do something about that. I would feel more comfortable if all 4 of these people had GPS trackers. I would love to create exclusion zones that are not residential exclusion zones necessarily or solely residential. I would like to create zones where these people should not go, particularly around places where there are children, given that 3 of them have a child conviction, at least according to what we have here. So I'm interested in exclusion zones and working with community corrections and/or parole to get their buy-in for that. So it's not that we just go create an ordinance, we get their consultation before we do that, because I don't think we're gonna have a high chance of success if we just go write some ordinance that we like, but it's not something that they feel obligated to think about. I think I said this already, more use of the halfway house for sexually violent predators when they get out. And then I would like us to also think in this group about who we dispatch, right? I think having somebody have a violation and the parole officer calls and says, what's going on, and they don't get a satisfactory answer, I would be fine with using our police to respond to that. If they get a satisfactory answer, fine, they don't even alert our police, and I'm not trying to create more workload, but I don't know. Another thing I'd like to learn is how often does that happen? You know, how often does it happen that a parole officer actually gets up from wherever they are and travels to wherever somebody is violating? Because if it's infrequent, and we're only talking about 4 people with GPS trackers, I would be very interested in understanding that and in potentially having our officers dispatched when the parole officers had some concern. And then I think it couldn't be a better thing to do than to convene, and we can act as a convener, a task force to recommend best practices, and we also say what it is that we're after for protecting our citizens better and for reassuring everyone that they're safe in the community. I mean, it is not just about preventing the offenses, which is very important, but it's also about making sure that people feel heard and see action taken that says that we share these concerns. So I think that's the end of what I had to say, but I do appreciate everyone making sure that we are paying attention to this.
So we have Jan, then me, then Aaron, and then Mary.
I definitely agree that we've learned a lot tonight. I really hesitate to make a whole lot of decisions tonight because I really feel like it's got to sift in a little bit more, and we really need to think about it. You know, I heard, Bob, very, very specific evidence that if you create exclusion zones for residential, that it increases recidivism. I can't say that word. Recidivism. I met with Stan and Katarina, and you know they have done the studies on it, and that is not something that has helped anywhere. And then it also impedes progress in terms of people getting jobs, et cetera. So I think there's plenty of data for that, plenty of it. Chief, I've got a question for you, because one thing that struck me was the level of these misdemeanors that then seem to point to future offenses. And I had a woman tell me the other day that she was in Beach Park, and up on top of the play gym was a man, kind of sleeping or hanging out in the top of that clearly children's equipment. And she called the police, and the police said, there's nothing we can do about this, it is public space. Which got me wondering, there are definitely places like, you know, children playgrounds and schools and things like that where kids are, and we don't want, not that it's always men, but, you know, most of them are men, we don't want single men hanging around those places. So do we have any ordinances that restrict people, any people, not just, not just SVPs or sexual violators? Do we have any ordinances that protect those areas where children go?
The answer is, unless there's court-ordered restrictions, no. A single male can hang out in a playground unless they're violating a law or a city ordinance. They have the constitutional right to do that. That's not saying it might not be concerning. There's lots of behavior that's concerning, but until they break a law, there's no action we can take. We can go, we can talk to somebody, we might be able to get their information, do some follow-up behind the scenes, but just hanging out there in and of itself, unless it's a violation of law or an ordinance, there's nothing we can.
And neither of you have heard of any cities that have put ordinances in place to basically protect playgrounds from lurkers?
Well, we do have parks rules that address behavior, but no, nothing, I'm not aware of anybody who's done that.
New York City has done that.
Yeah.
Oh, have they?
Well,
I wonder if...
Well, so in what way, Bob?
There's a law in New York that unaccompanied adults cannot hang out in children's playgrounds.
Well, and I've heard the same thing about museums. Some places say, like a children's museum, unaccompanied adults can't hang out in a children's museum.
Can I just say, anecdotally, I've seen those signs on playgrounds in New York City that say that unaccompanied adults cannot be on this playground.
So I guess I'm going down that path because I really wonder if maybe that is something that would help us with our objective is to protect our people. There's no one on this council that isn't highly motivated as the first priority to protect the people, especially the kids in our community. So what is the best way to do that? And I guess just kind of one more comment, and that is that there's no one here from 23rd and Canyon or 16th and Canyon or 23rd and Canyon, and there are 60-some sexual predators living there.
No, 65 violators, then not sexually. They're parolees for all sorts of crimes.
Okay, parolees okay.
Not sexually.
But still, there's probably no one around that area that knows that, and we're not hearing from them tonight. So I really hate to move the problem from one place to another just because we think maybe that's the solution and anyway we can't do it. So I don't know. Clearly, we need to put some things in place to protect our community, and I think it has to do with the homeless shelter, for sure. We know that there's been some violence up there in that area in the last week. That is extremely concerning. So I think there's some actions that we need to put in place to protect residents up there in general, not just from those three people. And I would really hate to see us go down the path of an ordinance that has been proven time and time again to not work, and it does not have the support of the Colorado people. It doesn't have the support of our county DA's office, and I just think it's not the right way. We need to come together as a community and figure out what is the best way to protect our community, rather than just writing an ordinance that we think won't do any damage.
So I'm going to jump into the queue here, and then Aaron, and then Mary. One thing that, and again, I add my thanks for folks to come out here. This was a very useful session. One thing I did hear from folks was that better coordination amongst probation, parole, law enforcement, housing, and vocational services could actually be really helpful. And I think that's the one thing, I think multiple people agreed that that would be useful, and that's something that could lead to better outcomes. So I guess I would like us to head that direction. We may want to do other things, but that one seems to me something we should do and do soon. And, this Center for Sex Offender Management website, let's go look at that. If there's best practices of other communities that figured out how to transition people in a way that is successful such that our community is safer, I think that's what we want to do. So I would be very interested in directing Tom to put some thought into how we might do that, and I'm willing to direct resources as well towards such an effort, given that I heard that from multiple experts that would actually be very helpful. So that's my initial thought, is let's do that, and maybe that group would have some additional feedback for us about, do we need more GPS technology? Do we need some other resources in place that would actually make a difference? Because let's not just do something to make us feel better, let's do something that actually is going to work. That's my thought. Aaron?
Yeah, thank you, Zan, for that. I agree with that, the need for that better coordination, and I agree that with what people said, that we need to do something, and it's unclear to me what the best something is, but getting people together to work on best practices and coordination, I think, would be a great initiative. But I also think we need to do something about the concentration of the sexually violent predators at the homeless shelter. I hear an enormous amount of concern from the people who live in that area, and I understand it. It's a neighborhood with a lot of families, and it's bearing a really disproportionate burden of this problem because of the presence of the shelter. So that of the 4 SVPs in Boulder right now, 3 of them are at the shelter, and I think it's unfair kind of to put that on that neighborhood, particularly, given the nature of where the majority in general, and all of them in Boulder, have assaulted strangers or children and are judged likely to reoffend. So I would very much like to do something about that, and I don't know if we're going down the path of an ordinance that would enable that, but if we do not, I would like to see that worked into the management agreement with the shelter that's coming up in the next couple of months to exclude SVPs from the facility.
Can I ask a question about that? If we were going to do that, well, or maybe along with that, if we are going to try to make sure folks don't end up on the street but are somewhere in a controlled environment, it seems to me we would want to also convene a discussion with the parole board about the halfway house.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, because I guess I wouldn't say I'm making an additional point that other people haven't made, but I agree, should not be done in isolation, because we want to find other, valid, more supervised options, for folks in that situation.
Mary, Matt, and then Bob again.
So I think that one of the things that we learned tonight is that we learned enough to know that we don't know enough to be able to do the best thing tonight. So I am with the folks that have said we should convene some sort of a working group, or of the folks that Greg Brown itemized and said we should convene these people. And to that group, I think it would be wise to also add a victim or victims to have their voices heard in that group as well. Whether we do an ordinance or not, I think the best direction would come from a group that collaborated and talked about better coordination and give us better information. And I'm not so sure about having the shelter exclude SVPs, because one of the things that just, I think it was Katarina that put up the one slide that said inaccurate registries equals danger. And that's the last thing that we want to do, to just feel, just because we feel less fear, it doesn't mean we are more safe. So I would be hesitant to do that. I do agree with Aaron that there is a disproportionate concentration up in North Boulder. So if we can work it out through this working group and the state, and figure out how we might be able to work together to direct more towards the halfway house. I know we can't do that, but if there's a way that we might be able to get to that place, I would like to explore it. And then just one more thing on a completely separate matter that has nothing to do with what the topic of tonight's discussion, but to address a point that was brought up by Ally regarding that folks who can't organize as well. That resonated with me as well. And that's one of those things that I just want to point out to all of us, that it's those million little things that make us feel a non-inclusive community, is to make that kind of assumption that because somebody is low income, they can't organize well. So thank you for bringing it up, Ally. I appreciate that.
Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I generally agree with you, and with you, Suzanne, about at least what the next steps forward are. And with Jan, in the sense that, last time I did not want to pursue an ordinance. And yes, I think I've learned a lot too, but in fact, it convinces me that an ordinance is not the right way to proceed, especially with inclusion and exclusion. Everything we continue to hear is that makes things worse more than it makes things better. It may make some people happy, potentially, but it doesn't make the situation any better for anybody involved in this. And we also have, as a city, a certain limited role we can play, understandably. I'm actually somewhat surprised the courts allow cities to do some of this, and I suspect that they won't forever, because these people need to go somewhere, whether we like it or not. I mean, if I thought that we were, as a city, being unfairly treated in the sense of, and one of the questions kind of got to this, where we were, being handed too many of these sexual offenders, whether they're just sexual offenders or SVPs, I think that would be a slightly different case. But in fact, these people have a relationship with the city of Boulder. Their crimes were committed here, or they lived here, or their families are here, or something. I'm not sure what you think should happen to these folks other than they vanish, but that's probably not going to happen from the state level. So we're going to have to deal with it at some point, and seems to me it's much better to deal with in the way that we understand where these folks are. I'm also not, I don't get, and we've heard actually evidence to the contrary again, about the connection between where somebody might reside for the night and where they go during the day and where they might or might not commit another crime. Those seem to be rather unrelated one to another. And as somebody said, I think Jan, moving them to Central Boulder is, we'll just hear from people in Central Boulder, and astonishingly, there are actually kids who live in Central Boulder. There is a pretty big park that's just a couple of blocks away from that site. So you can't make this go away. There's no magic wand here. You have to deal with it. And I think looking at some additional coordination is an excellent idea. I would be concerned, maybe the rest of you aren't there, but I think the city should absolutely play a role in some coordinating discussions, but I'd sure be concerned about suggesting that significant city resources should be put into this. It's not exactly our place, and the problems, such as they are perceived and perhaps are real, are, I think, much more due to the way folks are handled and other types of coordination faults along the way. And we actually heard that from people who said, and Stan as well, DA Garnett, about, go to the state legislature. They're really controlling most of the things we care about. And we kind of get that little piece at the end where we have pretty limited ability to make any significant difference. So that's where I'm at, and I would not support an ordinance now, or, certainly we don't know enough, and I think it would be much more likely to be to yield negative results than positive results. But I do think some sort of coordinating committee to look at this a little bit more is an excellent idea, and not to put a plan on the shelf. To really seriously figure out what the pieces of the puzzle are that a city can and maybe should do something about, as well as what types of approaches should we take at the state and county level that could actually make significantly bigger differences in the long run than whatever we might be able to do as a city.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? Matt, I know that Christopher Lawyer has ties to the community. Is that true for the other 3 SVPs?
I don't know. I asked the question at one point, I think in general, and the answer was, yeah, most of them, the crimes were committed here, or something like that. I'm sure it's not 100%, yeah. But.
Do you mind if I just said?
Yeah, no.
You all know, Chief Tester, about the existing 4 SVPs?
Because we asked this last time.
Yeah, I don't have that information.
Okay.
That's fine.
I don't know that. I don't know that answer. Katarina's telling me that 2 of the 4 she's sure were committed here, but I don't know that answer.
Thank you.
Here, why don't you come up?
Introduce yourself.
I'm Shannon Alaba. I'm the spokesperson with the police department, and so I don't remember the specific names with crimes, but I know 2 of the offenders that are designated SVPs. Their original sex offense was committed in another state. They came to Colorado, and they reoffended in Colorado, actually in Boulder County. I'm not sure the specifics. There's a 4th, and I'm not positive off the top of my head if he actually committed a crime in this area. It might have been in another state.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, all I would say to that, because it is a good question, we did ask it last time, is I think that's something that is worth pursuing in this kind of collaborative effort of, and again, of course, it's the parole board that places people somewhere, not cities, and not counties either, for that matter. But I think better understanding that and understanding what criteria they use and how that's done, if I can use this term fairly, is absolutely worthwhile understanding better, and it's something we clearly do not understand very well right this minute.
Bob and then Sam.
So I can see the headline in tomorrow's Daily Camera. I'll write it for you, Alex. Boulder appoints task force. So that's the best we can do. So this has been in front of us for 3 months. All of these organizations that we say that we want to get together could have gotten together without our assistance. We're legislators. Our job is not to facilitate communications between the state parole board, the state probation folks, the police department, the district attorney's office, the halfway house, and all the other agencies. They could have been talking for years. They could have been talking for the last 3 months. And yet, here we are up here saying, you folks need to get together and talk, and we'll help you do that. That feels very hollow and unsatisfactory to me. And I would like to encourage those organizations to do what they apparently should have been doing for a long, long time by indicating to them that we're on the verge of passing an ordinance, because I know that you don't want us to do that, so I'd like to threaten something that you don't want us to do to get you off your butts to do something you need to do. And so it's very frustrating to me that we're once again going to simply appoint a task force and have lots and lots of confabs here and get folks to do what they should have been doing for a long, long time. So I'm very, very frustrated about that. Second, the statement's been made that an ordinance would not be helpful. I still haven't heard any evidence that it would be hurtful, and that it would be a waste of time, or would be, I think, the rather offensive statement that Greg Brown made is that it would be a feel-good measure. Our job is not only to make this community safe, but it's to make this community feel safe. And I think an ordinance that limited where these sexually violent predators could go would send a signal to our community that we want to protect them to the best extent we can.
Can go or live? No. Are you saying where they would live or where they would go?
I would limit where they could go.
We have Sam, and then I'm jumping back in.
So I'm right where Bob is on where my instinct is. I'm not quite where Bob is on that I think we should take an action tonight, because I'm not quite sure exactly what that should look like, because it should either be, and we have to involve these other organizations with the planning of whatever it is we do, I think, because we have perhaps limited authority here, so we're going to require their cooperation. So I would use definitely language less strong than Bob did and more cooperative, in the sense that I agree with Bob, that I think ultimately what we want to do is limit where sexually violent predators can go in our community. And I'm going to read from that website, a set of facts from the websites that says, providing specialized supervision, and this is in light of preventing reoffending. And it says, these conditions of supervision depend on an offender's risk level and risk factors. They often include no contact with victim, no or limited contact with minors, limited or no internet access, no use of alcohol or drugs, restrictions on where they can live and work, restricted movement within the community and within and across state lines, and reporting to probation and parole officers is required. So some of the things that Bob is talking about and I am thinking about are on this list here. It's movement restriction. Right now, parole boards are the ones that can do that, or probation officers. But I think if we can do something that layers on top of that, rather than, less than that or requiring less than that, I think that might survive a legal challenge. Further, let me read the very next section, which is called using surveillance. In some instances, electronic technologies such as electronic monitoring or GPS devices help monitor sex offenders while under supervision. Because these technologies are quite expensive, and some studies suggest they are most effective with higher risk offenders, these surveillance techniques may be best used with only the highest risk or violent sex offenders. I think that specifically describes some of the things that I'm interested in, and it comes straight off the website that we were recommended to check out. So at any rate, I do concur with a lot of that. I have one more comment, which is that I live just up the street from 23rd and Canyon. I run and bike past that and walk past that location all the time. I had never noticed this halfway house. And so I think one of the reasons that the people in my neighborhood might not be as against this is they already house this facility, and many of them probably have no idea. And that is a testament to how well the facility is probably run, that it probably shows and reads as an apartment building.
It does. I went there on my drive about with the police. Okay, so just to be clear, I don't think anybody, and this is not the headline for tomorrow, is that we're convening people to talk about stuff. So I do want to build on something, at least I heard from everybody, is the idea of having a coordinating committee is so that, well, a couple things. I think one is, at least for these 4 individuals, to make sure that that the supervision and coordination is in place, so if there's a violation, that it is more efficient. Somebody doesn't have to drive from Westminster to figure it out. So I think that that's something that maybe can happen kind of immediately and will provide better reassurance and clarity about the supervision that's taking place. So that's what I mean by coordinating. So just to be clear. I think also, and I guess this goes towards direction, is I think we could use some more information about these 4 individuals. Why only one's on GPS? Why maybe not all 4 are under supervision? And maybe there's nothing we can do about it, but I think we should ask all the questions to see if we could influence that. Okay. So those are 2 things that I think are pretty concrete. I am interested also, I'll just throw that out there, in getting the state to own this issue, because it's not just our community. So anyhow, I'd like to sit down with our delegation and understand better if there's state policies that need to be fixed, so the parole board is paying a little more attention to the labels they're giving people, and whether, how the process of placing and what's appropriate, and do they have the right resources. To me, that's a worthwhile thing for us to do. I know that's not as immediate, but it's still towards a longer-term solution. Okay.
So I thank you. I appreciate all the feedback, and there's some really good ideas there. And I know you all were here till 11 o'clock last night, so you must be tired. So let me sort of suggest something. Jane and I talked briefly. I would suggest that we Jane and I put together a work plan that we would put in IP within the next month that is a method to explore all the things you've suggested, not taking anything off of the table. Work with experts in the community, much like we did with the marijuana advisory panel. Get people who know the subject a lot better than I do, get them to the table, and see what we can come back to suggest to council, meet with them, and as I said, keep everything on the table, everything from an ordinance to coordination, and come back and report to council with recommendations for further action and progress with some of the things you've suggested, which can be done in the short term.
Yeah, and Tom, can I ask that you specifically work closely with the parole board folks, because to see to what extent they're amenable to coordination and enhancement maybe of what they do. I don't know how willing they would be, but if we say, well, gosh, if we contribute some resources in a certain way, would you be willing to do a little more than you normally do?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you.
Is that good? For now. I guess I do want to thank folks again for coming and contributing to our thought process here, and we'll continue to move forward as a community in addressing this. And I appreciate our experts coming and enlightening us, and to be continued. So thank you all.
I tried to amplify your voice.